It's very easy to criticise the Harry Potter books. Admittedly quite fun, because there's lots about them that's just absolutely bonkers. So weird and confusing and often badly written, sometimes genuinely mean. But there's also lots of good reasons people love this story as well, right? Like, I grew up with it, I cannot help feeling charmed by this world to some degree, and it makes it very confusing as a result to figure out how I feel about Harry Potter nowadays. On the one hand, there's so much stuff about it that either doesn't hold up or is badly executed, plus J.K. Rowling has become the person she's become. Whichever camp you're in on the argument of separating art from the artist, it's hard not to have some of your feelings skewed by her as a person. And then on the other hand, the charm to this world is more than just nostalgia. There are genuinely good things that I can't overlook just because I personally dislike J.K. Rowling. There's lots of things that are worthy of praise here. Plus, my inner child did for the most adore these books. That isn't just a mark of nostalgia, I think that's also the mark of a story that spoke to children. There's a great skill in doing that, and one that's often underrated. And then we can even say that how much of the criticism levied at these books is fair. I think the arguments that who cares, it's a bit dumb, this is a children's book, stop nitpicking and have fun with it, I think that is a very valid argument to make a lot of the time. So what the hell do I feel about Harry Potter? Is it just a turbulent mix of different emotions and opinions that cannot be explored in a coherent way? No, we're going to explore it now, because I think all of the problems with Harry Potter become most apparent when you consider how much better the books could have been. How much more could have been done, because there's so many things you could do to improve them. And I don't just mean like clearing up plot holes that are a bit odd, because like sometimes doing too much of that can harm the actual story itself. I mean legitimately improving this story, improving the characterization, the craft of the writing itself, obviously the world building. My god, are you in for a treat when we get to the world building. I think because J.K. Rowling's big villain arc has made it fashionable to criticise Harry Potter, it becomes easy to forget that people were always criticising Harry Potter. People were fully aware at the time just how weird the house elf slavery plot point was. Even I can remember having this weird feeling of emptiness about the books when I got to the end. Like, something about them just rang a bit hollow, and I could never put my finger on what. I wasn't old enough to really understand what I meant then, but I think there is something strangely shallow about the experience of Harry Potter, and I don't just mean like the depth and the meaning to it, I think the actual experience. We're going to try and put the finger on why that is. So I am making this video because it's too easy to just trash something with criticism. What would we learn from that? You know, I think constructive criticism is more valuable. I think we then get to learn something about the writing and the editing process by exploring the possible ways problems could be fixed, or sometimes why it's difficult to fix them. I think that's a great exercise in understanding writing itself. Then partly this is a means for me to process my feelings, but mainly I think exploring all the ways the story could have been so much better is actually the clearest way to demonstrate what's so very wrong with this story. That's not always the case, but I think that applies here. I think it's when you try to fill in the hole that you recognise just how deep down it goes, just how vast and empty. So that's the plan. And we're splitting this video into 4 big sections: craft, characterization, theme, and world building. Each section starting with a little introduction on why that element is important and what the overall problem is, before breaking into specific chapters on what to fix and how. There might even be a 5th section to this video by the time we get to the end. I don't know. I've got so many notes for stuff I could include, and I'm not going to include it all, but I might add some extra stuff in by the time we get there. And finally, before we begin, I have to explain this is not a video of me saying, look how great a writer I am. Hindsight is a wonderful thing that makes it very easy for me to look smarter than I actually am. Yes, that's true, but that's also exactly why it's a power we can utilize here. We can harness that. Hindsight frees us to best analytically break down story problems and provide possible solutions, which itself is obviously an easier thing to do than writing the actual story. I know that, but it's still a meaningful, valuable thing for us to do, something that can teach us a lot, so we're doing it. Yep. You're all sticking around for that as well. I'd advise using the timestamps to take breaks when you need them, because this could end up very long. I'd be very surprised if I managed to record all of this in one sitting. And also, this is just about the first book in a series, the Philosopher's Stone, or the Sorcerer's Stone in some countries. Yes, I have this much just to say about the first book. Maybe I'd make this a series and discuss all of the books, but that depends on how many views this one gets. It's the kind of video that I think will either do really well on YouTube or will get absolutely nothing. I'm very much hoping it's the first one of the two. But regardless, let's get into it, starting with the simplest section first. Craft! Yep, the easy section first. Very easy, the technical writing of the book, because I don't need to say much here. I think this is where using the argument, shut up, this is a children's book, does best apply, because for a children's book, it's mostly fine. You know, sure, it's annoyingly repetitive at times. How often characters are described as saying things coolly? That's a real pet peeve of mine reading these books. Or how we're always getting descriptions of Harry's heart always leaping, or sinking, or doing strange sort of somersaults whenever anything happens that might make him feel something. I mean, there are bizarre dialogue choices at times. My favourite is when Harry and Hagrid are on the Minecraft ride all around Gringotts, and we get, they plunged even deeper, passing an underground lake where huge stalactites and stalagmites grew from the ceiling and floor. I never know, Harry called to Hagrid over the noise of the cart. What's the difference between a stalagmite and a stalactite? Stalagmite's got an M in it, said Hagrid. And don't ask me questions just now. I think I'm gonna be sick. That's the best you're getting for a Hagrid impression. Why is an 11-year-old boy who, literally a sentence before this, thought he'd seen a dragon, why is he asking about the difference between stalagmites and stalactites? Why are children reading this expected to know what the Joanne is on about there? All of those things do annoy me and aren't good, but are they enough to devote a long discussion to here? If we ever get to making a video on the Goblet of Fire, for example, there would be a ton to say about the craft, because the less Joanne starts to use an editor, the more the books become a complete mess. Total lack of pacing, the beginning of the book is structured in an awful way, dialogue becomes heavy and repetitive, and there's lots of little skits that are supposed to add comedy, but in a forced way. That would be worth a big discussion, there'd be a lot to say there, but generally, Book 1 in terms of craft is okay. A lot of the stuff is written in a very exaggerated, cartoonish way, but that is again very fitting here. That's what speaks to children. Cartoons exaggerate features for a very good reason. And I think the way J.K. Rowling uses description does lend itself to that, because you do get the repeated phrases about Snape having his hook nose, Hermione's bushy hair, features that do make them visually stand out and easier to imprint in a child's mind. And also, you know, Harry lives in a cupboard under the stairs. That raises many questions in a realistic world, but it's also an evocative idea for kids. It's clear, it's visually striking. Similarly, who cares Dumbledore leaving a baby on the porch with just a letter and then whizzing off is a mad thing to do. Lots of characters do act a bit over the top and do things that are all weird in a real life context, but that does work very well. I'm going to be very generous about the craft of the writing in this first book specifically. Just the first one. 100% Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is the strongest of all the books in this series because it's the youngest. Because you're not supposed to take things too seriously. Snape bullying children you're supposed to see as a cartoonish expression of how strict teachers feel towards kids. That makes sense here. The problems come later in the other stories when it's all supposed to age up and slowly become more serious and more realistic. Because now, how do you marry the earlier over-the-top madness with the later very serious realism? Dumbledore leaving a baby on the doorstep or Snape being horrible and yet still somehow a teacher, that makes sense in book 1, but how do you account for it in books 4 or 5, 6, 7? Joanne creates a hell of a lot of knots for herself there that she can't quite untangle. So I think that's actually the biggest task with this book. How do you much better set the foundations for the realism of the later books? How do you much better lay the groundwork for things to be aged up without having to lose all of the fun cartoonish nonsense that speaks to children here? How do you find a middle ground between the two? That's the big quest here, and it's something we're going to get into generally in all of the sections of this video. But yes, for now I just wanted to say, as a whole, the writing style is fine for what this book is specifically. Generally, the one obvious thing I do want to discuss in terms of the craft is the fat phobia.
Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise.
Now, there are other uncomfortable views that do enter these books. Those are more so in the later books, admittedly. There's surprising shades of misogyny I did not expect to find rereading this. There's cultural problems, let's say, with characters like Cho Chang and JK's world building for the other wizarding schools. There's the whole goblin thing. There's stuff as a whole we can talk about like that. Stuff it's probably easier to discuss in the later books, but the one that directly creeps into the writing itself, the craft of this story, the way sentences are structured, is the fat phobia. The very deliberate choices made in the descriptions. You know, I haven't reread Harry Potter in a long time. I vaguely heard several years ago about backlash to do with fat phobia in the books, but I had no idea just how egregious it is. It's almost comical just how intense Joanne went with this stuff. Like, Dudley can barely do anything, can barely be mentioned in any sentence without some adjective to remind us, yes, he is fat and it's grotesque and we should laugh at that. Dudley is described as a pig in a wig. He hates exercise. He is always eating, always. He is first described to us as a large pink beach ball wearing different coloured bonnets. Hagrid curses him with a pig's tail but admits he was trying to entirely transfigure him into a pig. However, he was so much like a pig anyway that there wasn't much left to do. There's all of the same repeated lines. When he moves, it's waddling, never walking. He's got 5 chins. We're told that constantly. A lot of the time, the adjectives just make the sentences more clunky. Like, the next 2 examples are from the 3rd book, because that's the one I'm reading at the time of putting this video together. But there are very similar descriptions, lots of them, in all of the books. Uncle Vernon clapped Dudley on his porky shoulder. Why is the word porky there? It makes the sentence so clunky. What even is a porky shoulder? Like, surely a good editor would see that and say, trim that word, it's not needed, it makes the sentence feel long-winded. I would like to imagine that happened, but if so, that would mean Joanne argued, no, I want to keep that word there. I want people to know that Dudley has a porky shoulder amongst all the other 200 descriptions in the same chapter. Dudley spent most of the summer in the kitchen, his piggy little eyes fixed on the screen and his 5 chins wobbling as he ate continually. I added that example because whilst it's not quite as cruel as Joanne at her worst, we have a very simple sentence here. Dudley spent most of the summer eating in the kitchen. I mean, that's mean enough, but we've got to stretch this sentence out into something incredibly long-winded and difficult to read so that we can have no less than 5 references to Dudley being fat or lazy. 5 in a single sentence. It's just absurd how much Joanne will hinder the effectiveness of her own prose just to be mean about weight. Kind of like with Roald Dahl stories, you can't quite escape the mean-spirited streak in Joanne's writing. It is just here. There are various examples and elements where you can separate art from the artist, but stuff like this built into the prose of the story makes it feel inescapably J.K. Rowling. It's the thing that leaves me with the most bitter taste rereading these books, and the thing that does make separating art from the artist most difficult, because you can just feel this meanness, the bitter, bullying ridicule. It's horrible, it's dehumanizing. The larger kids in schools, more often than not, are the ones getting bullied, and these kind of cruel stereotypes of them as stupid and lazy and evil people do not help that. On the one hand, this is a very old-fashioned, Roald Dahl-esque bit of humour that's over the top and exaggerated because that's the cartoonish quality we're working with here. You can make that argument. However, God knows how many kids who were bullied for their weight wanted to read Harry Potter to escape into a completely different school world, only to be told again, be told repeatedly by the writer, weight is comparable to ugliness, meanness, and stupidity. This would have an effect on any child reading it. So yes, for that and the sake of the actual craft itself, tone down the fat phobia, more than tone it down. That's a change we would make, but that's kind of all I need to say there. I don't think I need to go into breaking apart the sentences and rewriting them myself. I think it's quite obvious what you do. You just take out all of those descriptions. So as a result, we're not going to dwell on any of this. We're going to get into the bigger stuff of this video. The next section is characterization. And actually, I think we'll discuss Dudley first for that section. Characterization. Much of the trouble with characterization in the books comes down to 2 points, as far as I can see. One is making caricatures, and then the other is not daring to undermine those caricatures. For example, Dudley is set up as a caricature, a horribly dehumanizing one at that, but basically an overweight, brutish bully. And to an extent you can do that. You can have a character that's overweight and is also a bully. And you can have Harry think mean things about him, like, of course you can. Harry is an 11-year-old child terrorized by his older cousin. He probably would relish any chance to insult Dudley and to think of him in very unkind ways. But that's Harry's perspective. That's a kid with immensely strong feelings and not the most objective view of the situation. In that sense, yeah, it's fine to make characters that feel like stereotypes. That's part of the appeal. We've said this already. Snape is the strict teacher, Dumbledore is the wise but odd guru, Hagrid is the gentle giant. Give the readers that to begin with if you must. However, gradually you do need to build your characters out beyond the caricature. The same way you start seeing more layers to people in real life as you get to know them better. Dumbledore is the wise guru, but what else is he? Not much, actually. That's part of the problem. The books are so insistent on you seeing Dumbledore as this unquestionably good, unquestionably brilliant man that it becomes very jarring when we see him doing things that aren't good at all. So I've got no problem with JK presenting stereotypes for her characters. As I say, that's clearer. Sometimes that's the whole fun. Rita Skeeter being this ridiculous satire of a journalist, for example. Lockhart being a caricature of a fame-obsessed fraud. That is the fun. You can do that, but if you want these characters to stick around for the later books and have meaning in the story and be people we invest in, then you need to start undermining the stereotypes. Be that poking fun at them, or adding new layers or dilemmas, or just letting people grow the way people do. We need that. This was basically what I meant when I said the problems were presenting clear stereotypes and then not undermining them. I mean, presenting a clear, very rigid view of characters and then none of them ever getting to grow in the story. That is a big part of why Harry Potter can feel so hollow, because people in real life do grow and they do change and they are very fluid and contradictory. If everyone continues to just be a cardboard cutout, then the world feels incredibly flat. Even in the first book we need it, so let's get into it. Let's start with Dudley and how I would change him.
You're a
world builder.
Harry.
I'm a what?
A
World builder.
And a thumping good one, I'd wager.
I can't be a
World builder.
Never make anything
up.
Anything you can explain?
Through meticulous exposition.
Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have
Offered 51% off World Anvil! Oh, you better believe it's World Anvil! They are sponsoring this video, they are offering you 51% off, and they are an online tool for building worlds, you may have guessed. But also creating characters, designing and managing campaigns for all sorts of different games. My best friend uses it for D&D, but there's lots of other games. You can use it for planning your stories, writing your stories, working on all sorts of creative projects. For me, it is my novel. I need a tool like this, otherwise I am far too chaotic. We're moving flat soon and I literally have 6 cardboard boxes full of random sheets of A4 paper I've written old ideas on. Pre-World Anviled me was a nightmare. So with something like this, not only can I keep everything organised, keep it all in one place, be able to easily edit things, but I can create timelines, I can create hyperlinks branching off specific characters or articles or a billion other things that just make it so much easier to find stuff. Planning things can be hard, especially when there's so much to do, but having all of these tools to help visualize it, to help split everything down into specific points, articles one at a time, it helps immensely. I'm not going to show you because it's a secret, but I've created different bio pages for all of the characters in my world, even the minor ones, which house they live in, what their job is, who they're friends with, who they hate, what different beliefs they have or opinions about events that go on in the book or whatever. So, World Anvil is great. I hope you can hear my passion, and if you desire, if you crave. If you call to the heavens for a 51% discount, then use the code TREE, or click the link in the description, or the pinned comment, or if you just want to try out the free version, then go for that. You know, there's no time limit on it. Test it out for as long as you want. World Anvil.
Piers, Dennis, Malcolm and Gordon were all big and stupid, but as Dudley was the biggest and stupidest of the lot, he was the leader.
Okay, I will concede Harry being very thin because he is malnourished, where Dudley is very well fed, is a contrast that makes sense. I get the idea there. However, in my mind, you make Dudley very well built, large and muscular and very athletic. Not to turn him into like a jock, just that he eats a lot of protein. His parents want him to grow up big and strong. Vernon talks about how he will need that when he goes to smeltings. It also makes him more visually imposing. Physically, let's change that. And secondly, yes, let's undermine the stereotype that is still set up, a brutish bully. There is zero diversity to the ways Dudley behaves in the books, and not only does that come across as unkind towards him, but it's also very boring, because it's always exactly the same. All of the Dursleys have their few defining traits, and that's it. That's them in every situation over and over for the entirety of these books, maybe except for the final one. So just sprinkle in a few seeds here. Nothing major yet. There's time for him to change in the later books, but we do need a few little glances of something different, something that suggests the potential to change. Makes you go, oh, maybe there's more to this character. How do we do that? Well, I think we all know deep down, at least initially, Dudley is not to blame. His parents taught him and encouraged him to be cruel to Harry. The whole family dynamic relies upon projecting onto Harry. Dudley is still a vulnerable, easily swayed child here. It's not to say he's totally innocent, but he's not at the heart of this. And I also cannot believe for all the times Dudley spends in the house alone. I mean, yes, he sees his friends a lot. Not that they're really characters we get to experience. He does do that. But I still cannot believe there are never times where he just feels a bit lonely in the house, wishes he had someone to play a game with, and so falls upon playing with Harry. Just that. Give us a sense Dudley sometimes plays with Harry when he's got no one else, and then sometimes gets along kind of well, actually. Only he is also swayed by his parents' views of Harry, and it makes things complicated. You can do this in one single paragraph in the first book. That's all we need here. And there are a few of them in this first book where J.K. Rowling is basically just using a paragraph to summarise time passing at the Dursleys, you know? Summarising what they've been up to the last few weeks, what's going on. You can just slip this in there. Mention that Dudley would occasionally invite Harry into his playroom, often to show off whatever latest toy that Harry doesn't have, but at the same time you can describe how they would end up playing quite nicely at first. Maybe both of them playing a game on the PC. Harry is almost having fun. But then he performs much better at this game than Dudley does, and Dudley gets mad, so he hits out. He perhaps turns violent, or he cries. His parents then return and they spot Harry in Dudley's playroom, and they are like, what's going on? Why are you in this playroom? And Dudley immediately switches roles. Suddenly he's saying he never wanted Harry to come in. Harry forced his way in, forced Dudley to let him play on the PC. Harry was mean and cruel, and then Dudley can smile at getting to see Harry being told off. You see that? We're not changing the dynamic that goes on here at all, but we are faintly hinting that there's the potential for something else. It's no longer Dudley is horrible to Harry because he's just downright horrible as a whole. It's because he wants his parents' approval, and because he wants to feel better than Harry. Dudley becomes insecure seeing that the supposedly dark sheep in their family is doing better at his own game than he does. We're not adding anything deep here. This is just a one small paragraph thing, but it is laying the groundwork for maybe exploring Dudley a bit in the later books. Maybe an older Harry starting to realise what we're first getting a hint of here, which, you know, would be nice. A character arc. Not so revolutionary an idea. So yes, that's Dudley. What about his parents? They're a bit more complicated.
His large purple face right up close to Harry's. I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in that cupboard from now until Christmas.
Now, I don't want to describe too many things that wouldn't actually be in this book, but I think I need to on this occasion. A lot of what I'm about to describe is backstory not to be explained in book 1. Maybe to be explained in a later book, maybe never, maybe just leave it in subtext. I think we do need a vague sense of something though, so that we can slip in more dynamic between the Dursleys. You know, because most of the time there isn't one. Mostly the Dursleys all just agree and behave in the same way, which is attacking Harry. Harry. Occasionally there are some things that set them apart, like Petunia spoiling Dudley more than Vernon would, or we get moments of Vernon being scared of his wife's anger. Occasionally there is kind of something there, but it's not consistent and it's not enough to make these characters feel alive and interesting. If we build in a slightly more interesting backstory, even if we never explain what it is, we can then have slightly more dynamic and slightly more conflicts to play upon. So here's one possible example of what that could be. It's quite a simple one, but it doesn't matter too much. Let's say Petunia used to have a job in a local community, something of importance where she felt proud, maybe even like the mayor or something. I don't know. She loved it, however Vernon wanted children. Petunia didn't really want children. She wanted to focus on this job she felt so proud of, but Vernon kept pushing and pushing until she eventually gave in, had to give up her job to focus on being a mother. She agrees and she thinks it makes sense, but she also does harbour a slight resentment here, that she should have to give up everything for this child. That just opens the door for Petunia to occasionally be a little callous when Vernon starts talking about how well his work is going, and to get a little bit of conflict around that. Even to get a little bit of humour about Petunia wistfully reminiscing on this old position she used to have. I used to be head of, I don't know, some comically minor thing, and how often she talks about that as a big bragging point. I don't know, that's terrible example, but we're adding some kind of dynamic that you can then make stuff out of later on. We can build on it even more if we want as well, like all of the pride she first felt about her job flipped into house pride when she left. Petunia wants everything spotless, and this child Dudley, a child that a little part of her resents for making her give up her career. She gets angry with him whenever he makes a mess. She spoils him, partly out of guilt for that anger, but also to keep him out of the way. Endless new toys to occupy him in his playroom, out of the way there. I think it would be quite nice adding a little tinge of loneliness to Dudley. And then Harry, who she can feel she's free to be resentful towards, to not kind of suppress that emotion. She therefore pours all of the resentment as a whole onto him. And God forbid he ever makes a mess. God forbid Dudley ever makes one and blames it on him. Hopefully you can imagine how easily you can make little skits out of these aspects now. It's like a sandbox, really, just chucking in different toys, different aspects and dynamics to their characters that we can then play about in different scenarios. The more different things we can do with the Dursleys, without having to entirely change what the characters are, the more different stuff we can do, I think the less extremely the books would fall into making them one-dimensionally horrible. I'm sure half the reason the books are so cruel about them and we get all of the fat-phobic comments is because JK never gave them any other traits to do anything with. She never built in anything else she could mine for comedy, It's a problem. And then there's also their feelings about magic. Petunia hates magic in the books because she was jealous of her sister, basically. Vernon hates it because it's weird, because it threatens their middle-class image. Is that enough motivation? Yeah, maybe for the first book, maybe, but we never learn any more after that. We never feel there's any greater depth. We're just meant to believe Petunia hates her sister to the point of thinking she deserved to die simply because she was jealous of magic. In the book, we basically get this one rant. Oh, she got a letter just like that and disappeared off to that school and came home every vacation with her pockets full of frog spawn, turning teacups into rats. I was the only one who saw her for what she was, a freak. But for my mother and my father, oh no, it was Lily this and Lily that. They were proud of having a witch in the family. That is something. There is an attempt to give them some character there. But I do think we could sprinkle in a little more. In my example, and again, this is backstory not necessarily to be explained, Petunia is still jealous of her sister, yes, but also lost without her. Their mother left when they were young and never contacted them again. We don't really need to get into the history behind that, but Lily is the older sister where Petunia is younger. And without their mum, Petunia feeling anxiously in need of a maternal presence, as a result she clings very close to her older sister. Fears further abandonment. She needs her, especially in school where Petunia can be bullied by others and needs Lily's protection there. But then suddenly Lily isn't there anymore. Lily's gone off to a weird magic school that we aren't supposed to tell other muggles about. So now Petunia's alone and bullied all the more. Plus there's all sorts of rumours about what Lily's distant school is. Students teasing her about that, them saying she has a freak for a sister. Perhaps a perspective that Petunia then starts to believe, hence this use of the word freak. I don't know, but Petunia then isn't just jealous of Lily, she's also angry, betrayed, abandoned. If we wanted to dramatise it to the absolute max, this might be a step too far, but we could say their dad started to grow ill, and all of the care, all of the responsibility fell upon Petunia's shoulders, whilst Lily was off having fun in a completely different world. At least that being Petunia's perspective on the situation. You don't need to explain all of that in book 1. All you need is a bit of anger to be present in Petunia's rant and for her to say, I needed her. She wasn't there when I needed her, she was away, kind of thing. That's at the very least. We could obviously add in more than that, but yes, that is enough of a hint to make us go, there is something more here, something I can wonder about to be explored in a later book. This is what it's all about. Again, preparing the story to be aged up in the later books in a way that isn't jarring. Petunia is still a cartoonish caricature here, but also there is a reality behind it that we're faintly hinting at. And by the way, we were talking about dynamics, and this is great for Vernon and Petunia, because whilst Vernon's dislike of magic is understandable, the total all-consuming rage he feels at the mere mention of the words, despite no history of his own in relation to magic, that is definitely a bit much in the books. So with how we've changed Petunia, her feelings around magic become much more interweaved with a level of trauma, and then as a result, all of Vernon's anger can be about protecting Petunia, being overly protective and overly anxious that the mention of magic might upset his wife. He's now angry on her behalf, which adds a bit more nuance to his rage and how it can work, plus it's just more interesting. A kind of shared family fear of mentioning past trauma makes sense as an idea to touch upon, and it makes this moment where Petunia does explode into a rant much more satisfying, because there can now be a kind of build to that. We can rework Vernon in the last 4 chapters so that he's going overboard trying to shield his wife from magic. That's why he's doing it. And then when it gets to this scene where he's most puffed up and most trying, Petunia tells him to shut up and breaks into a rant of her own. Everything she's been holding back all this time. Doing it that way, it now tells us much more about their relationship to each other, and also there is the faintest trace of an arc.
Never, he thundered. Insult Albus Dumbledore in front of me!
We're not going to go through every character here, that would take forever. This video is already going to take forever, but there are many of them that will crop up later on when we can talk about other things. Hagrid is going to crop up for a lot of stuff later on, but I will quickly say now that I think Hagrid almost has an arc in this book. J.K. Rowling almost accidentally wrote a character arc for him about drinking. Yeah, because Hagrid frequently drinks in this book. He is often seen drunk, and then at the end when Hagrid realises drinking in a pub with a disguised Quirrell, he got drunk enough to blurt the secrets about how to get past a 3-headed dog. Hagrid realises he did all of that from being drunk and that he could have caused Harry to die. You could have died! All for a dragon egg! I'll never drink again. I should be chucked out and made to live as a muggle. Of course, nothing changes with Hagrid in the next books. He goes back to drinking just as much as ever. This is never mentioned again. There's no great attempt from him to quit. I think Hagrid should quit. I think we can make this his arc in book 1. I think we reach this point at the end where Hagrid realises drinking partly caused him to do something that might have led to the rise of Voldemort and the death of Harry. Therefore, he decides to give up. And then in the later books, he can give up drink. Either that can be an arc itself in those books, the struggle to actually quit, or maybe not. But whatever the point, him quitting alcohol is a thing that happens in his growth. I think that could be really satisfying. We lack so many character arcs in this story. It's part of why it rings so hollow, because you never feel like anything really develops or changes. Let's add that for Hagrid. You know, it is kind of odds in a children's book how much it sort of normalizes alcoholism at times. Let's do something with it, you know? So, okay, how do we make that a proper arc in book 1? Yes, first, let's not normalize the drinking. Like, as the book is, there's never any comment on it being a bad thing, really. It's just Hagrid, it's just what's acceptable for an adult member of staff at a children's school to be regularly drinking alcohol. And to be constantly relying on the emotional support of children and needing them to break make the rules on his behalf, by the way. That's a separate point. Harry, Ron and Hermione in this book lost 150 points for Gryffindor because they broke curfew trying to help smuggle a dragon egg away that Hagrid got, despite it being illegal because Hagrid was drunk at the time and he likes dragons. So that's change one. Maybe just have some moments where a character can raise the point. Hey, this might not be a good thing. Or maybe Harry even just thinks it. After his trip with Hagrid to Gringotts, Hagrid sends Harry off on his own to Madame Malkin's while he goes to get a drink to recover from the cart ride. Yep, he sends an 11-year-old off on his own in a place he doesn't know while he goes to the pub for a quick pint. Just have Harry maybe think this isn't a great thing to do, or be annoyed about Hagrid doing that, you know. Just pepper little things in like that make you question the normality of this drinking. Or even Hermione's the obvious solution. Have her to tell Hagrid, maybe you're drinking too much, at whatever point in the story, and Hagrid can dismiss it. He can say he's fine, he only ever drinks in the evenings, he knows how to handle a drink. Sure, teachers aren't supposed to drink, but after hours is different. Dumbledore keeps a drinks cabinet in his office or whatever. It's not a problem, Hermione. Whatever other arguments he might make to justify it. And then the dragon egg business happens and he brushes it aside as a one-off. Yeah, it was stupid me buying it. Yes, I got too drunk that night, but when someone offers you so many drinks, you can't say no. That was a one-off, it won't happen again. And then the final beat, Harry almost dies and Hagrid has this moment of breaking down where he swears he will never drink again. So what we're doing then is structuring this in beats. All we then need to change is to make it a more serious point when Hagrid says he's going to give up drinking. Rather than as it is, where Hagrid is being just... Well, I think we're meant to see him as overly emotional here. J.K. Rowling often seems to criticise or ridicule people showing too much emotion in these books. You see that much more in the later ones, but I think we're meant to dismiss Hagrid's oath here as being dramatic or hysterical or something, because Harry quickly snaps him out of it. Hagrid, he'd have found out somehow. This is Voldemort we're talking about. He'd have found out even if you hadn't told him. You could have died, sobbed Hagrid. And don't say the name! Voldemort, Harry bellowed. And Hagrid was so shocked he stopped crying. I've met him and I'm calling him by his name. Please cheer up, Hagrid. We've saved the stone. It's gone. He can't use it. Have a chocolate frog. I've got loads. You know, it's kind of nice seeing Harry cheer up Hagrid here, but I also feel like that's minimalising a really important point. And also, yeah, trivialising Hagrid's emotion, kind of ridiculing it to an extent here. I personally think this is an emotion worth taking seriously. Harry can cheer Hagrid up, that's fine to do, but also maybe we should have this scene concluding with the idea, yes, quitting drinking is a good idea. I'm going to talk more about Hagrid and the dragon egg later, though.
And it showed your friend Ron himself as head boy. How did you know? I don't need a cloak to become invisible, said Dumbledore gently.
Dumbledore is simple. In the later books, when we are supposed to take stuff more seriously, we get this weird dissonance between a man doing obviously questionable things and a man we're told is always the best person ever. I have no idea why people say he's the best headmaster Hogwarts has ever seen. What has he even done? You know, how has the school changed? I think for book one, we just undermine the image slightly. Set the stage for the idea that yeah, maybe some people will question him in the later books. He can still be a good character, absolutely, but we can also doubt some of his methods or his actions or his beliefs. Just make it a little bit more possible to doubt him. Arguably that is one of the themes this book is supposed to be exploring, how good people, how adults can sometimes let you down, which is true, it happens inevitably at times. Hopefully they don't let you down as drastically as Dumbledore often does, but you know, so just make that a little bit more possible, and I think that will actually make the goodness in Dumbledore more real. So how do we fix that in the first book? I think just this one real change. At the start of the book, he drops off Harry at the Dursleys, and McGonagall is there who thinks it's a bad idea. She thinks they're a bad family to give Harry to. But Dumbledore explains he needs to grow up away from fame, and McGonagall thinks, yes, you're right, of course. I think just have McGonagall continue to disagree, continue to doubt Dumbledore, but it's his decision, he has the authority, and McGonagall trusts him despite her opinions here, so accepts the decision. Yeah, this one's a very small seed, that sometimes Dumbledore's logic can baffle even his closest admirers. Ron refers to Dumbledore as off his rocker. Make that a bit more the case. Not to say Dumbledore is necessarily wrong in a lot of his decisions, but to say that sometimes people have doubts. We can't do too much in this first book, because to doubt Dumbledore too much would damage the way Harry's supposed to see him right now. And there are some other points we will make about Dumbledore. We'll get to them at other points in this video, some of them really important, but for now we're focusing on the characterization itself. Finally, of the four main characters of this book, the ones who really need arcs. The four main characters, of course, being Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Malfoy.
Then I'm going to drag them off to look at racing brooms. I don't see why first years can't have their own. I think I'll bully Father into getting me one and I'll smuggle it in somehow.
The main characters don't really have an arc in this story. As situations change, Harry becomes a skilled wizard and confronts his enemy Voldemort, but there's not much internal character change. And that really harms not just this book, but all of them. People change barely at all. And I think if we fail to do that even in the first story, then it makes the possibility of changing them in later stories more difficult. I think you're setting yourself up to fail. And again, this is about tweaking the story we already have, rather than just me writing in whatever the hell I want. Draco needs an arc. There's a lot of different things we could do, but I think based on the story we already have, there's one very obvious thing we could do. One that doesn't require too many tweaks and actually provides Harry with more of an arc in a lot of ways. So, to start with, who is Draco in this first book? He is a very smarmy, one-dimensional, superior type comic villain. He first meets Harry and Madame Malkin's, not realising who Harry is, and he runs on a load of waffle about superiority and all of this, and Harry immediately doesn't like him. Then, on the train to Hogwarts, he realises who Harry Potter is, and so, despite being rude to Ron in that scene, offers Harry his hand. This basic moment from the film.
Some wizarding families are better than others, Potter. I can help you there. I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself, thanks.
But then Draco turns immediately nasty at the rejection. Unless you're a bit politer, you'll go the same way as your parents. They didn't know what was good for them either. That didn't take long, did it? Draco 100% established as a bad person, suggesting Harry's parents dying was what they had coming and that Harry might go the same way. They then all almost have a fist fight until Scabbers intervenes. That's Draco cemented, you know, that's him. He's horrible. Harry and Ron especially really hates him and really want to give him comeuppance at every moment in this story. The book revels in the comedy of making Draco look foolish in different moments and Harry getting to celebrate that fact. Draco deserves to look foolish because he's bad. He is all bad. And again, to an extent, this makes sense. It is that classic comic villain thing. Heroes and villains are a lot clearer for children. I'm not going to criticise this entirely, but it's also part of where Joanne's mean streak appears. Because in her stories, it is always very fair and very funny for bad people to be humiliated. However, A, this obviously causes problems for Draco to be a satisfying character, and B, in my experience, that mentality is exactly how bullying happens in the first place, that someone deserves to be humiliated for whatever reason. And sometimes a child thinks a certain other person is bad simply because they don't understand them. I think we can have fun comic villains and classic ideas of comeuppance. We can still have that, but without it always feeling like bullying Draco, you know? All you need to do is give us a bit of understanding for Draco, give us something that can make him seem human, someone we can empathise with to an extent, even if we don't like him. And I think out of that we can get a more realistic rivalry between the two. With very minor tweaks, there's a version of this story where Draco is insecure when they first meet in Madame Malkin's, where he's running on and bragging and acting all snobbish because he's nervous about joining Hogwarts, about whether or not he's going to do well there. Harry can think Draco's not very nice, but there's also faint hints of there maybe being more to it, maybe a sense of insecurity. And then when Harry rejects his friendship later on, rather than Draco just immediately villainous, we could have him be genuinely taken aback and kind of hurt. Extending a hand to someone you've only briefly met and them saying, no, I don't want your friendship, you know? Don't have Malfoy come back to this with something so obviously villainous. Come back with something that's a little defensive and maybe hurts. Not good enough for the famous Potter, am I? Or maybe you want to hang around with Weasleys and that oaf Hagrid to feel so much better in comparison. That's not a very snappy example, but something like that. Something that makes it clear Draco has a reason to dislike Harry here as well. Sees Harry, as we do get some hints later in the books, sees Harry to be an attention-seeking, famous, overly heroic Saint Potter. I think we can use that idea much more to build a more believable rivalry between the two. So we tweak that, and then in this first book do almost everything the same. All of the rivalry, the two trying to get each other in trouble. Even all of the bullshit ways Harry gets special treatment from the teachers. Like when Draco thinks Harry's going to be in trouble for flying a broom to get Neville's Remember-All, only for him to be made Seeker on the Quidditch team. Or this bit, Draco complains early in the book that there's a rule at Hogwarts that first years aren't allowed to own broomsticks, they will get confiscated. Then Harry gets sent a Nimbus 2000 in the post. Draco sees this arrive and he delights at calling a teacher. "Potter's been sent a broomstick, Professor," said Malfoy quickly. Yes, that's right," said Professor Flitwick, beaming at Harry. "Professor McGonagall told me all about the special circumstances, Potter. And what model is it?" "A Nimbus 2000, sir," said Harry, fighting not to laugh at the look of horror on Malfoy's face. "And it's really thanks to Malfoy here that I've got it," he added. Yeah, you keep all of that the same until the two later end up in detention with Hagrid in the Forbidden Forest. That scene. The groups get split up so that it's Draco, Harry and Fang forced to walk together in this forest, and they talk. They can have a bit of a spat. You know, Draco has a lot he could say in this scene. He hates how Harry is some attention-seeking kid who gets special treatment because he's famous. My broomstick was confiscated by the teachers, but they buy you one themselves. Of course, you end up on the Quidditch team as the youngest Seeker in a century. All of the teachers give you special treatment. They all love you. And Harry's like, no, they don't. Snape loves you. He gives you special treatment. But then Draco starts talking about Harry always playing the hero. There's a troll in a dungeon, so you have to go and fight it. Neville loses his Remember-All, so you have to get it back and show off in front of a crowd. You know, these are all very valid points. That's the fun. Our perspective throughout the book hasn't seen the events in that light, but you can understand why Draco would feel that way. It makes sense. And then all you do, in the middle of this rant from Draco, is slip in some minor point about his dad, about the pressure Draco is given from his dad to excel at Hogwarts, to be the best, to be superior, only for Harry to show him up at absolutely everything. It's infuriating for Draco. Which again, this is stuff that is already kind of in the books. What we're tweaking is an arc that's almost there. It's just never highlighted because we're not supposed to empathise with Draco. We're supposed to hate him as the villain. So yeah, in my version, Draco says all of this, and we kind of understand him a bit there. And we can have a small moment where the two almost find a truce. Harry can explain that he doesn't mean to draw attention. He wasn't intending to fight the troll, and he's not better than Draco at everything. He's way worse at potions, and even then it's Hermione who's top of most classes, but that doesn't have to be a problem either. No one's wanting to show Draco up. We all have a pressure to excel. I like that idea. I like the possibility that, not that they become friends, but that they almost make up. They almost let go of their rivalry here. Reach some mutual understanding. Harry promises Draco that he doesn't mean to play the hero or to seek attention. He doesn't want it. He's used to being invisible before Hogwarts. He promises that, and Draco kind of believes him. It'd be a very nice beat in the story, and that would change things. After this scene, they would stop competing and trying to get each other in trouble or score points. They would instead start to keep a slightly awkward distance. No longer quite knowing how to interact, you know? Ron is suspicious of Malfoy still, but Harry's a bit more understanding, a bit more hopeful. Until we get to the end of the story. Oh boy. Slytherin win the House Cup. They get a moment to celebrate before Dumbledore goes, hang on, we've got to add an extra very specific amount of points I've decided. Harry and his friends just single-handedly went heroically chasing after Voldemort and preventing his rise, breaking a ton of school rules, but I've decided they can win the House Cup instead. Let's all celebrate them. That happens, you know? Including giving 50 points to Ron for playing the best damn game of chess Hogwarts has ever seen. 50 points. It's nonsense. It's favouritism. It puts Harry under a spotlight again for everybody to clap and cheer him. I find it fun. You know, I really, really like the idea of Harry being conflicted about this moment. Celebrating the bizarreness of this odd kooky Dumbledore completely bullshitting all the points. You can poke fun at that in the book. And then Harry glancing over and seeing Draco's face in this scene. Seeing his expression and knowing, oh god, the rivalry is back on. Draco is never going to believe that I don't want the spotlight anymore. I like the idea of this setting them up for things to get worse between them in the later books. I just think it's a really good change. I think it makes their growth into a rivalry much more organic. I think it's more depth to Draco. And also there is an arc. There is a development here. A tragic one. Almost positive growth before events ruin it at the end. We need more character arc in this book. Plus, by the way, it does also open the door for possible more development in the later books, because there is still space in the later books for Draco to potentially start to learn differently, or to even break from his father's pressures, or alternatively for him to get worse. How will Draco feel in the second book when Harry is getting signed pictures with Lockhart? And it also kind of gives us an arc for Harry too, which we're going to discuss in a second, but I just remembered I haven't mentioned Crabbe and Goyle yet.
This is
Crabbe and Goyle, two characters who are often there, but I don't think ever have any lines of dialogue, which is ridiculous. Two characters who exist as nothing but extensions of Malfoy, just there to make him look even more stereotypical. They are described often as guffawing at Malfoy's jokes, flexing their muscles menacingly. Crabbe and Goyle flex their muscles threateningly. Neither of them could do more than crack their knuckles and scowl. Their bulging muscles were no use against ghosts. Crabbe stopped laughing and started rubbing his knuckles in a menacing way. Goyle cracked his knuckles threateningly, and Malfoy whispered something undoubtedly malevolent to Crabbe. Joanne likes writing that phrase a lot. It's very odd when you think about it though. There's something very disappointing about two characters who could bring so much more life to this story, never getting to be people at all. Ever. I also cannot think of anyone in the books who is physically strong that isn't described like some dumb brute. Hagrid is kind of the exception there as the gentle giant, but also not exactly. So just simply let Crabbe and Goyle have a voice. They are needed, because Malfoy needs people to say things to, needs friends he can brag to, but let these two be characters. In whatever ways you might wish, it doesn't really matter how. I kind of enjoy the idea of making them slight parallels of Harry's group, like maybe Goyle is a slight bookworm and Crabbe is a fan of the same Quidditch team as Ron. And then just every now and again have a few bits where they could, for example, slightly undermine Malfoy by accident. Maybe a moment where Crabbe chuckles at one of Ron's comebacks, or a moment where Goyle corrects Malfoy on something that he gets wrong, or maybe even a moment where he corrects Hermione on some point of knowledge. I don't know, you could honestly do anything with these characters so long as you do something. That's all.
Stop Lily and James Potter's son going to Hogwarts? You're mad. His name's been down ever since he was born.
Harry is used to being invisible. The sudden fame is nice, but also overwhelming, which is kind of a point in the books. And whilst it would make for a better written story to make more out of that, it would also probably harm the story's success. You know, kids enjoy the wish fulfillment here, the lonely kid disappearing into a new world where everybody loves him and it's all amazing. If you make Harry too uncomfortable with fame and attention, you damage that wish fulfillment. And we can say, yeah, but wish fulfillment isn't a good thing. But I think sometimes it is, especially so in children's books, but also, you know, that's what Harry Potter's built a lot of its success out of. It is something the books partly utilise. Who am I to pick that apart? I've already lessened the wish fulfillment of getting to project all bad stuff onto Draco and Dudley, so I probably shouldn't lessen the wish fulfillment too much here as well. However, Harry does need an arc. How can we do that without having to tweak too much about the story? Yes, I think we do explore fame, even just a little bit. So when you get all of those moments where Harry does something good and then everybody claps, Harry can enjoy the applause, but also wedge in a little bit of doubt too. He gets Neville's Remember All back, is immediately put onto the Quidditch team, and Harry can be uneasy about that. He can at first not want to join because he doesn't know how to play. What if he's laughed at? What if people say the famous Harry Potter isn't so special after all? Harry just wants to keep his head down, but Ron encourages him to go for it. I think that would be nicer. Also, more generally, Harry can be a little bit uncomfortable with all the celebration and praise, partly feel like he's not sure he deserves it, not sure he's as special as everyone keeps saying, and then kind of building to an arc where he embraces it, you know? Hopefully not in a big-headed way, but embraces and feels confident in who he is. That's the general trajectory, I think. Let's build it in with some beats. You know, they fight a troll in the dungeon in this book. The teachers tell them off for putting themselves in danger like that. What were they thinking? Trying to play the hero. And Harry can think to himself, yeah, they're correct. I should have just told a teacher. We shouldn't have run in. That was dumb of us, but we panicked and we acted without thinking. Slot that into the story, and then Draco later accuses him of being a show-off in that Forbidden Forest detention scene we've just explained. But we can make this land even more, because Harry is feeling a little bit guilty in the story anyway. He doesn't just get detention, he also costs Gryffindor 150 points for sneaking around at night. Some other Gryffindor students shame him for this. Does the famous Potter not think the rules apply to him? This is humiliating. I think we can use this as a beat that makes Harry want to be invisible again. Which, as I say, is kind of already there. We're just highlighting it a bit more. Harry does cost Gryffindor those points and is sad about it, and a lot of students do judge him in a way that is awful for schooling environment. You know, this kind of public shame is not conducive to a child's healthy development, but that's a separate point. That's when we talk about how horrible Hogwarts actually is. All I'm doing right now is tying this story beat more clearly to an overarching theme of Harry struggling with ideas of fame. So yes, suddenly here, Harry does want to just be invisible again. Keep his head down, not draw any attention, not make things worse. He decides he's never doing anything crazy like that ever again, not getting involved in odd schemes of saving dragon eggs or whatever, until Fred and George come to cheer him up, of all people. They see Harry is sad, and so they mention all of the times they've lost Gryffindor house points, all the stuff they've done. Sometimes people get annoyed at them about it, but it hardly matters. Who cares about points anyway? All you win is a cup, and that just goes in some stupid trophy cabinet. What's the point? Hermione can disagree with that and say there is a point, and also it doesn't entirely cheer Harry up anyway, but then Fred and George add, who cares what anyone thinks of you? Harry, you lost 150 house points because you were helping Hagrid, because you were sneaking his dragon Norbert away to Charlie Weasley in Romania. Who cares what anyone thinks when you know deep down that you did a good thing? That's the bit that comforts him. I think that's kind of a fun setup as well. Harry coming to accept and embrace the fact he's famous means recognizing that other people's opinions don't actually matter. Obviously it isn't quite as simple as that, but it's still a nice general growth for him to feel by the end of this book. So that beat happens, and it does help Harry positively. And so then when we later get to the whole sneaking past the three-headed dog and all of these other challenges and breaking rules in order to stop Quirrell, Harry can briefly stop and have his doubts again. Maybe we shouldn't intervene. We are first years after all. Maybe McGonagall was right. Maybe we should just wait for Dumbledore to get back. Keep our heads down, keep out of it. Which to an extent is probably the right thing to do. We're going to address the whole idea of a child being put in danger later on, but yeah, Harry can feel that, and then Hermione, the often law-abiding one, tells them it's worth breaking school rules for something important. Like Fred and George said, who cares what anyone thinks when we know we're doing something really good? So yes, off they go. It's not a major arc, and there are some problems there, but it is at least an arc. One you can slot into the existing story without really needing to adapt too much. Plus, it does address an old pet peeve of mine. Why does everyone care so much about house points? If I was at Hogwarts, I would honestly not give a shit. I can see why some people would, but everyone also incredibly invested in winning a house cup? Having at least Fred and George think house points are stupid is just something to poke fun there. World building feels more real when your characters can have differing opinions about aspects of your world. So I do think that's a nice change, and I think following this, Harry wouldn't care too much in the following books about house points. Hermione would, and so would Ron. He's very competitive and enjoys the rivalry, but not Harry.
She had a bossy sort of voice, lots of bushy brown hair, and rather large front teeth. Whatever house I'm in, I hope she's not in it.
Hermione is a very school rule-abiding witch who learns to loosen up when it matters. Admittedly, she has this same arc in a lot of the books, but that's a problem for those books. It still works here. Ron's arc kind of stops halfway through this story. He dislikes Hermione at first as an insufferable know-it-all, to use Snape's phrase. Then he learns to appreciate her as a brilliant witch. Oh, and plus he wins a game of chess, and in doing so proves he is a valuable person. He is not overshadowed by all his more successful siblings. He is just as impressive because he wins a game of chess. I'm being a little bit flippant there. I do think this book uses the tool of getting Dumbledore to award people points as a way to try and make it seem like they've had great growth and mask the fact that they haven't, but still both of their arcs are basically okay. They're not great, but they are the sidekicks in a children's story, as long as there is some functional arc of sorts that is probably enough. With that said, I would like to do more, especially giving Ron some more growth. Seeing as he begins this book somewhat jealous of Hermione's magical ability, and we do kind of get a moment of Ron's growth when, after the spat about Hermione being good at Wingardium Leviosa, Ron gets to use it on the troll in the girls' bathroom. He learns the spell, he pulls it off. Well done, Ron. But it is kind of that, and then winning a game of chess, and I'd like to have more of a moment in the conclusion where he can show off magical ability. And as a result, I think we can split the structure down a bit more into 3 distinct beats. Beat 1 is Hermione being good at spells in class and Ron not being as good and being a bit jealous of her. Beat 2 is the scene with the troll. Ron tries the spell, but we're going to do what they do in the movie, not to steal its ideas, but I think they do the very sensible thing here, which is have Hermione somewhat guide him through using the spell.
Swish and flip.
I think that's important for 2 reasons. One, because Book Hermione literally just stands here for the whole scene, screaming and frozen in fear. I suppose that kind of makes sense as a point that Hermione knows all the spells but hasn't learned to act in the moment yet type kind of growth to happen later. But that isn't really the arc that happens anyway, and I think it's better to let her do something here. So, like in the film, she can guide Ron. That's beat 2 though. Beat 3 is some moment past Fluffy, involves some obstacle we can invent where now Ron uses the spell for a 3rd time. Or technically a 2nd, because he couldn't do it the first time. But this time he performs the spell without any guidance from Hermione, and he uses it at a greater range or with a heavier object than any of them have pulled off before. Ron uses Wingardium Leviosa, but this time in a really impressive way. One that slightly surprises him, one that Hermione finds genuinely impressive. She tells Ron as much, making him go a little bit red. I just think that makes Ron's growth a bit clearer. And I know this is basically just a growth in magical ability, that's not really an internal character change. However, there is still somewhat a development of Ron being quite insecure about his abilities at the beginning of the story, being a little bitter as a result, and then at the end finding more confidence. So I think that is something as an arc. The other little thing I'd like to do for Ron is this bit in the book. Sneaking on their way to the room where Fluffy is, they're under the invisibility cloak, but they encounter Peeves. The poltergeist is there, he hears someone else is there, he obviously can't see them, but he's not going away, and Harry has a sudden idea. "Peeves," he said in a hoarse whisper. "The bloody Baron has his own reasons for being invisible." Harry does a perfect impression of the bloody Baron out of nowhere, and it scares Peeves away. Which is a fine moment, you know, but I'd give that to Ron personally. Harry already does enough stuff. Ron doesn't get huge amounts to do, so I'd also have a beat earlier in the book where, like, Ron has been doing impressions of people as a bit of a laugh in the common room. He does a funny Snape impression, he attempts McGonagall, and then he discovers he can do a really good impression of the Bloody Baron. Just setting that up so that we can have it pay off properly here. It's a very minor point, but I just think it makes sense. Now, Hermione. As I say, her arc is fine, but I think we do have problems with her motivations and the ways others treat her in this book. In The Philosopher's Stone, Harry and Ron both find her really, really annoying at first, and they're pretty rude to her. This is the case until the business with the troll. They save her from the troll, but they are about to be told off by the teachers until Hermione steps in and lies. She says she deliberately went after the troll. She thought she could defeat it, and Ron and Harry stepped in to save her. She did a nice thing for them. Now they agree to be friends as a result, and we get this interesting line. It was really lucky that Harry now had Hermione as a friend. He didn't know how he'd have gotten through all his homework without her. Wonderful. Great reason to be friends, because she can do your homework for you. She is annoying and nagging until it's convenient and helpful for you. Great job. No, look, I'm absolutely fine with them all having spats. I think that's good, that's conflict. I just think when there isn't any depth to it and to Hermione. It comes across as quite harsh and also shallow. You know, the best question to ask is, why does Hermione so strictly follow the rules and so obsessively study and go over the top with her homework? What if the answer to that question isn't just because she's an annoying goody-goody two-shoes, but we tolerate that for the sake of a friendship? What if there's a bigger answer, you know? So, for example, what if it's because Hermione is Muggle-born? She didn't know anything about the Wizarding World until she got her letter. Now she's supposed to go to a whole school all about it. That's terrifying. She wants to learn as much as she can as quickly in case she's not as good as others, in case she's behind them. And then when she does get to Hogwarts, she obviously is as good as other people. In fact, better most of the time. And yet maybe we can hint she still feels looked down on by some people. We're not introducing the word mudblood just yet. I think that is better to introduce in the second book. But for her to still feel some kind of judgment and assumption, from Draco obviously and a few others, a kind of surprise that she's as good as she is. An assumption that's there but not always explicitly said. Hermione then feels determined to be exceptional as a result of that. She feels she has to be exceptional, otherwise she will be overlooked. And if we want, we could ramp all of this up even more. Maybe her parents aren't dentists in the book. Maybe they worked ordinary jobs, something physically taxing, like a labourer maybe. And Hermione grew up studying hard in ordinary Muggle schools because she felt a pressure that they wanted her to reach university or get a better job than they did. Potentially, I don't know if that's a bit too forced. Another idea I find kind of fun is make Hermione dyslexic. Have that be something she was bullied for in Muggle school and she felt judged over, and that gave her an extra determination, A, to read, and B, to outperform others as though to prove them wrong. And then that same basic determination spills into her study at Hogwarts. There tends to be an assumption that people with dyslexia can't be avid readers, so I think it would be fun to counter that with Hermione. Plus, you've actually got an emotion behind all her studious now. It's not just she's studious because that's the way she is, there's also a thing characters can explore, which means you can do so much more with her as a person. So I would quite like a moment where Hermione just opens up a little bit of this stuff. They become friends, but Ron continues to make his snide remarks about her going over boarding classes, and she snaps back that Ron doesn't need to prove himself like her, which Ron can disagree with, of course. You know, he feels in the shadow of his brothers, but it introduces the thought that you can have a moment at the end for Hermione to find some reassurance that she doesn't need to be as driven. Not that she shouldn't be, but that she doesn't have to feel such a pressure and an anxiety about it. Which, admittedly, is quite a clunky solution. I think that's a very heavy-handed, simplistic conclusion to our arc, but if we wanted to do anything more, you have to add in so much stuff that it alters quite a lot of the book. So yeah, let's just say that, you know? At the end of this book, she's at the end of year feast, and Hermione makes a comment about how she's already got all her books for the next year, and she wants to start early on the studies. And Harry and Ron can exchange a look, which she notices, and then she says, or maybe I'll start in another week. Maybe I can just relax for now. And I think it is an important growth to establish in book one, because one of my least favourite plot points from the story is in the third book, when Hermione is given a time turner to study a ridiculous amount of lessons. And it means mountains of homework, and that she gets super stressed, and it's awful. And I just think, why did the teachers allow that? Why did they let this child work herself into such a whirlwind of anxiety? An already brilliant student as well. Why did they let her do that when a reassuring word would have prevented all of it from happening? That's a real problem with the third book, and I think if we tackle some of this particular demon now, Hermione's feelings around the pressure to study, if we can at least explore that just a little bit, it sets us up much easier to do more with it in the third book. Oh, and here's another thing I'd change with Hermione. Don't have her lie on behalf of them fighting the troll. I think that's really unfair on Hermione. I think it ruins a perfectly good moment for Ron to show growth right now. For Ron to apologise to her. The reason Hermione was in this toilet in the first place is because she was crying there. Ron had very much upset her. It's kind of his fault, you know? I think it's better if he honestly admits that to the teachers. Hermione was only in here because I'd said something horrible to her. Something I didn't really mean. We heard she was in here upset, we heard about the troll, we panicked and ran to help. We didn't think the troll would be in the bathroom itself, but we just wanted to make sure Hermione was okay. That's not example dialogue, that's me just summarising. But yes, I think Ron needs that moment. Otherwise, it makes all their treatment of Hermione seem justified. They upset her to the point of crying, and somehow she's she's the one who has to make it up to them here. Which I can't criticise entirely, because they do run to save her, they do show care in that already, but I still think it's better if Ron apologises. As a whole, that concludes our section on characterisation. And you'll notice there's not actually huge amounts I've changed about the characters here. They're going to come up again with other weird things they do in this novel that we have to address. Yes, but I don't think it's really about big changes. When people say a story doesn't have enough character development, often that doesn't mean you need to add in much more dramatic things, bigger ways. I think it just means the change that could be there or is there already needs better emphasizing, clearer to feel it happening, much tighter, better developed beats, a building structure, you know? That's all I've done, but it's super important and I hope it stops the rot, because yeah, that's another reason book 1 is the best book in my opinion. The fact the characters don't change that much doesn't matter here to the same extent it does in the later books. Here you can kind of chalk it down to just being the start of the story, but when Harry and Ron and Hermione are all basically the same at the very end of the 7th book, then it's a problem. Then it's really weird how little anyone, apart from like Draco, does change across this series. I think that's a big part of why the ending feels so shallow. The sheer amount people change from the age 11 to like 17 or 18, I think at the end of the books. People change so much in that time, and yet these characters don't. I think that is J.K. Rowling's biggest weakness as a writer. She's so conservative, both literally and in her writing. Everything must maintain a status quo, and it's so boring and unfulfilling, and I don't think that's laziness on her part. I think it's a lack of confidence or a lack of daring. She had so many imaginative ideas when it came to like Bertie Bott's every flavoured beans or whatever minutiae, and there's some really great ideas for twists in these stories, but pushing her characters, shaking the world, that's a different kind of daring and imagination. That's probably the hardest kind, I think, when writing a story. The only thing Joanne is ever extreme about is the one thing you don't want her to be extreme about, which is her political views. I shouldn't get petty, but I can't help myself there. Overall, there is a lesson we can learn on this whole section of characterization, though. People aren't just defined by who they are or who they seem to be, but by how they grow and change. Sometimes you do create wonderful, interesting worlds and characters that fulfill something for you as a writer in some subconscious way. Or they're just really good, and you want to preserve this thing you've made, this really good idea. Like Will Ferrell in the Lego movie. I've made the blocks fit together in this way, that's how I like it, this is perfect, keep it like that. But no, you're writing a story. That means change. Like in the Lego movie, you also need the kid to come in and f*** everything up. that bit's the story, you know? There's the advice. Make your world, make your characters, then f*** them all up. Theme! Theme is an odd point of discussion in Harry Potter, because technically we know Joanne's themes. Nothing trumps a mother's love. Loyalty is sacred, good must conquer evil. And from a point of personal preference, I don't really like those as themes. I think a mother's genuine and unconditional love is obviously a wonderful thing, but in the books that mostly tends to mean a mother sacrificing themselves for their children. It rarely, with Molly Weasley I think being the only exception, means we get to see a mother being a good mother in a way that isn't just dying, you know, which is a shame. Nothing trumps a mother's love, but good mums are dead mums? I am being a little bit flippant, but even more so, I don't like the explanation Dumbledore provides at the end of this book that Voldemort couldn't kill Harry as a child because of his mother's love. That's a magic more powerful than he could understand. I find that really cheesy, idealistic, and it makes you wonder why this doesn't happen more often. Because surely there are other parents who would sacrifice themselves for their kid if the situation required it. Personally, I wouldn't have Dumbledore say that. I have other ideas about why Voldemort failed to kill Harry as a child that I'd save for another book, where right now I think Dumbledore can just say he has a few theories, he isn't entirely sure, he doesn't open up his thoughts to Harry there. I think I probably would change that, however there is a but, one we're building to. To quickly mention the theme of loyalty, yes, I personally think loyalty is a wonderful trait, but it's also a dangerous one. Especially dangerous for a story to praise and idealise loyalty within a children's children's book. A story about children loyally following teachers who definitely do a lot of questionable things. I think there is a danger there. And thirdly, good versus evil. I think when a story's supposed to become more complex, you do need something a little more morally grey. Good versus evil probably works for this first book though, and that's kind of my point as a whole. That's what I was building to. That just because it's not my personal preference of the theme doesn't mean we should replace it. You know, my personal preferences aren't technically relevant here. These are the themes we've got for the story. This is what Joanne presented. And even then, what would we change? You know, exploring ideas of motherhood. I think that should be parents as a whole, regardless of gender. I think that's something more for book 2 though, when we actually get scenes with a set of parents who are supposed to be good. We see Molly and Arthur Weasley briefly in this book, but I don't think we should pad out the story by making them appear even more and doing something with that. I think their brief appearance is fine for now. That waits for book 2, exploring the question of when loyalty is dangerous. Yes, that's absolutely something worth doing again. Really important to explore that, seeing as loyalty is already a theme, but again, not in book 1. Young Harry needs to first be allowed to see Dumbledore as brilliant. So none of these things really need tweaking at the moment, however that's not all that constitutes theme. There are themes you intend to explore in your stories, and there are themes that more accidentally crop up. I think this is the great point we're going to talk about, and the thing that probably requires the most self-awareness and reflection when writing. To spot the things that less consciously leak into your story, so that you can either A, expand them even more if your subconscious mind was tapping into something really good there and you want to do more with that, or B, rework them in case this accidental stuff is creating problems. If that all sounds a bit vague, we're about to explain. Let's discuss the thematic problems with Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
Harry lay in his dark cupboard, wishing he had a watch. He couldn't be sure the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking to the kitchen for some food.
There's a lot of cruelty in these books, some of it working fine for a children's story where stuff is exaggerated. Yes, we've said this already, exaggeration is fine. Exaggeration sometimes actually works as a safety blanket for stories. For example, if you're exploring abuse in a very cartoonish way, it stops it from being too overwhelming for a child to easily process the ideas there. You see kids doing exactly that in play therapy sessions all of the time. And in a similar way, I think showing cruelty in children's stories isn't necessarily a bad thing. The world can be cruel, and kids see that in the world, and it can be very difficult for them to understand it without some stories and ideas to explore what it's all about. However, at what point are we normalizing abuse here? You know, why does everyone decide it's perfectly fine for Harry to go on living with people who are clearly abusive, who are awful to him? Why is nobody ever particularly upset about that fact? I mean, Harry may not be, as a matter of psychological defense against the trauma there, but there comes a point where we need to know that the Dursleys are genuinely harmful, where we need the framing of the story to make that clear, rather than that they're just mean and a bit unfair, and that it's funny because Harry gets to have his own back on them in various ways. I don't think that's enough. And similarly, are there ever repercussions for teachers who behave awfully? In a perfect world, I'd completely rewrite everything to sort this out, but I can't. This is about tweaking the story we already have. I can't tweak it so that none of the remaining books are spent living at the Dursleys. That's a huge change that alters so many things. In which case, we have the problem of how do I allow Harry to continue staying at the Dursleys at the end of this book when it's so clearly not an okay thing for him to have to do? How do we make that happen without the supposed good teachers at Hogwarts looking horrendous? And how do we express that Harry going back there is not okay and handle all of that with some sensitivity? How? Again, you can make the argument it's a children's book, shut up, it doesn't matter that much, but like, this is stories children were reading to understand the world, to explore things. I think it's especially important. I think the best solution is actually the simplest one here, which is to have the books criticise Harry living at the Dursleys as a failure of the system. Hooray! Systems! If we're talking themes, this is one thing Joanne barely ever does. Criticise the systems. Because, you know, the wizard systems are so flawed. It's fraught with racism and slavery and laws that make zero sense. And rarely, if ever, does anyone criticise them or try to change them in these books. They're just accepted as normal and good and not something to mess about with. And that's really weird. These books so clearly feel like they're meant to be a story of children discovering the ways adults that were meant to protect them and the systems designed for them do sometimes fail. Sometimes children have to take on burdens they shouldn't have to. And not to minimise just how heroic they are, but it's still an issue. So, what am I proposing? Well, for one, dumb down the abuse just a little bit. If you wouldn't mind, Joanne, could we maybe just dumb down some of the... Yep. Secondly, it starts with Hagrid, I think. He goes all the way out to this weird shack to try and deliver Harry his letter to Hogwarts and wish him a happy birthday. He goes all the way there and slowly realises how the Dursleys have been treating Harry this whole time. He spots some pretty obvious signs in that shack. But the bit that annoys Hagrid in the book is that Harry wasn't told the truth about Hogwarts or his parents. You know, there's not too much concern about the emotional neglect or abuse as a whole here, just that Harry doesn't know about magic. And then Hagrid loses his temper and gives Dudley a pigtail, again, not out of any horror at the abuse, but because Vernon calls Dumbledore a crackpot.
Never!
He thundered.
Insult Albus Dumbledore in front of me!
Why he's punishing Dudley for something Vernon said as well is a very good question. It feels like a mean bit of humour, another cheap bit to go, haha, Dudley is a pig. But why Hagrid has to be so very angry and unable to behave like a mature human being here, I don't know. I said Hagrid gets unfair characterisation. You know, there's having a struggle with temper, and then there's traumatising a child because someone insulted your boss. In my version, what gets Hagrid so very angry here, but not enough to give someone a pig's tail because that's weird, is realising how they've treated Harry. I want to see Hagrid visibly spotting clues in this scene. Harry noticing Hagrid's eyes as he sees the stuff around him and looks visibly distressed by it, shocked. I want him to comment on their cruelty, not just the facts they kept secrets. And then after Hagrid and Harry leave and they're away on their boat, have Harry seeing that Hagrid still looks very concerned, you know? Maybe he even rants a little bit about it, mumbles on about the Dursleys and insists he's going to speak to Dumbledore about this. It's not right. And then later down Hagrid's hut, for one of the occasions they hang out at Hagrid's hut, Harry can just ask Hagrid if he did ever speak to Dumbledore. And then Hagrid can sigh and he can say that he did, and Dumbledore took it seriously, but he doesn't know what's going to happen about it. Hagrid explains Dumbledore is taking it up with the Ministry, but there's so many rules and laws around parental guardianship, especially when Harry doesn't have any remaining wizard relatives. He starts to rant about the flaws of the Ministry, realises he's with 3 children, and stops himself. Instead, tries to reassure Harry that it's gonna get all sorted out in the end. That's beat 2, by the way. Beat 1 was Hagrid saying he's gonna talk to Dumbledore. Beat 2 is learning that he did talk to Dumbledore. Then we get to the end of this story. Harry is in the hospital wing after fighting Voldemort. Dumbledore is there and they talk about a lot of things. Harry asks a lot of questions, so I think Harry can ask him, just as Tom Riddle asked Professor Dippet before, can I stay at Hogwarts over the summer holidays? A question that leaves Dumbledore with the unenviable task of explaining that that's not possible. And in my mind, considering like backstory stuff that we're not explaining, I think Dumbledore originally placed Harry with the Dursleys. Yes, because he had some vague theory about relatives having bullshit magic that protects him. Sure, but that is very much a theory in my version of the books. Not that any of this is explained in book 1, by the way, but that's just a theory Dumbledore has. And Harry was going to be placed there by the Ministry anyway. That was going to happen after his parents died, so Dumbledore wanted to get in and place Harry there first himself so that he could leave a letter for the Dursleys. Or better yet, actually meet them and talk, thinking he can explain much better than a Ministry official would. It's not Dumbledore's jurisdiction to place children in homes, but Voldemort had just died. Things were chaotic that evening. Dumbledore acted swiftly and the Ministry were going to do this anyway, so they just accepted it. In my headcanon, that's what happens that night. However, generally, Dumbledore doesn't have the power to home children. Of course he doesn't. Realising realising the way Harry is treated in my version, Dumbledore then does not want Harry to stay with the Dursleys any longer. In order for us to see Dumbledore as a good character, I think that has to be the case. I tried to look for it and I can't find it, but I'm sure there is some description in one of the later books where Dumbledore confesses that he was shocked by how malnourished Harry looked when he first arrived at Hogwarts aged 11. If that is a quote, even if I can't find it, if Dumbledore canonically felt that, then yes. In my version, Dumbledore would no longer want Harry to stay with the Dursleys. Hagrid then meeting him and telling him what it was like in that shack when he got Harry, that would strengthen Dumbledore's opinion too. So Dumbledore does try to argue with the Ministry, however it's their decision. The Dursleys are Harry's relatives, they're also muggles, which means it involves both wizard world and muggle laws and regulations about guardianship, making it a lot more complex and slow to rehome someone. And then where would you move him? To permanently live at school without any family is not a good solution. Staff and teachers provide a different kind of relationship to that of a loving parent. So send Harry to an orphanage or to a foster home? Potentially. Admittedly, I would be very interested to explore that in a later book, Harry and the struggle of foster parents, but I don't think there's space in the story for that. And for what this story is, I think the answer has to basically be that the Ministry refuse. So yes, we get to the end, Harry asks Dumbledore if he can stay at school, and Dumbledore explains to Harry that there are certain laws and things that can be appealed, but that it takes time. He explains he has reported Hagrid's concerns and the Ministry knows about Harry's situation. Dumbledore says they are glad to learn that Harry does have a proper bedroom now rather than a cupboard under the stairs, and that some kind of wizard social worker is going to visit them over the summer holiday. The Ministry are keen to make Harry's family environment work rather than resorting to rehoming him. So yes, we're making that a plot point at the start of book 2. A wizard social worker turning up. I think that could be meaningful, but also you could have a hell of a lot of fun with that scenario, especially when Dobby also gets chucked into the mix. Bit of a dull note near the end of this book. Also requires lengthy exposition that a child might be bored by. This isn't a great story plot point in that sense. It might be difficult to write this well, but I think it is still needed in book 1. I think there are enough other positive moments at the end of this chapter to offset the weight of this dull note as well. That's my theory, at least. I don't know if it would work. Same with a lot of these suggestions, you know, I would be kind of tempted to write all this stuff out and see if it works, fully adapting the novel, writing my own version of it, going through each chapter and each line, especially knowing doing that would probably annoy J.K. Rowling, but I don't have that much time to spend on something that would not help pay my bills in the slightest. So I have to concede that one probably would be a tricky change. However, I think the advantages still outweigh the disadvantages, and I think done with enough care, it probably could be done quite well.
Harry had got the idea that Professor Snape disliked him. By the end of the first potions lesson, he knew he'd been wrong. Snape didn't dislike Harry. He hated him.
This was the other key one to address because it's a bit of an accidental theme in Harry Potter that the teachers are awful. They just are. They're evil, or they're bullies, or they're woefully incompetent. And when they are good, they still have lots of issues that put students in a lot of danger, but we're encouraged to overlook those aspects out of idealised loyalty towards them. Anyway, arguably this whole section is very pedantic, because of course the teachers are awful. If they weren't, then our main characters would have nothing to do, and that would defeat the point of the books. No child wants to read a story about a kid who doesn't have to face dangers or overcome enemies because he can rely on his caregivers to keep him safe and behave responsibly. This is one of those plot hole-ish things that there's no need to take too seriously. However, it is nonetheless a theme in this story. Adults let you down. I think there are times that is a genuine theme Joanne was trying to explore, only she never quite knew how to, and then how resolutely loyal they're all also supposed to be kind of jars with this idea, which is a shame because you could have had an interesting conflict between the two. The conflict about trust and responsibility. Look, all I'm saying is in book 1 we need to better lay the groundwork to explore that kind of stuff, even if we're not doing it here. just in case there is space in the later books for that. And doing that requires that we just make it clear that the teachers are human. They are fallible people. They're not downright awful or unquestionably perfect. Even if Harry tends to see them that way, it's fine for Harry to feel that in the first book. But that still, subtly, we can suggest they are something between those two extremes. How do we do that? Well, we're going to discuss a few of the teachers in turn and what we need to do with them, but let's start with Filch, because he's easy. Here is a man who talks regularly and often about wanting to torture children. Hang you by your wrists from the ceiling for a few days. Got the chains still in my office? Keep 'em well oiled, just in case they're ever needed. Why is this an acceptable member of staff to employ at Hogwarts? I know we've all also got the question, why is a squib forced to work a job and endure difficult manual labour that a wizard could easily do in seconds? That's another question that I think I have a brilliant answer to, but that happens in the Chamber of Secrets, so that can wait. Right now, we've just got this. Filch being a caricature of, that bitter old man who hates children, I suppose, driven to the extreme that he wants to torture them. It's fine and good in the story for the students to hate him and see him like that a little bit, but I think some nuance and realism, please. Again, we don't need too much in book 1, but just something. That quote about chains comes in the books when Filch is taking them down to Hagrid for their punishment in the Forbidden Forest. He rambles on about torturous punishments and then hands Harry, Ron, Hermione, Neville and Draco over to Hagrid. I think all you've got to do is have Hagrid overhear some of this rambling and scold Filch about it. You know, Hagrid says, "You're not threatening them with chains again, are you? Professor Dumbledore has warned you about trying to scare students already." I should have attempted that in a Hagrid impression, shouldn't I? This isn't much we have to insert, because these two characters already have a bit of a spat in this scene. Hagrid already scolds Filch for lecturing the students.
Been lecturing them, mate. It's not your place to do that.
So you can easily slot in a bit extra here about Filch trying to scare them. Having Hagrid snap back a little bit helps to hint that A, it is Filch just trying to scare them, and B, it isn't an acceptable thing for a teacher to do. And then when Filch is gone, I think you can just have Hagrid tell them not to pay any mind to what he says. There are chains in Filch's office, that is true, but they're purely old decoration of the castle. That's all we're doing. It's not any exploration of character here, it's just allowing Filch to not be as one-dimensional as he first appears, and to make it seem slightly less insane that Filch is employed in this job, just a tad less odd. Let's talk about Hagrid here too though, because he's a great example for what I mean. We're supposed to see Hagrid as an unquestionably good man. Flawed, yes, but only really ever for the sake of comedy in the books. We're never meant to seriously criticise him, we're meant to think, oh, Hagrid's heart is always in the right place. However, this is a good man in the first book who, when charged after leading a vulnerable Harry around Diagon Alley, does leave him entirely on his own to go and have a pint. He then obtains an illegal dragon egg while drunk, which yes, is perfectly fine to happen story-wise. We've already discussed in the arc how this can be a good way to criticise Hagrid about his drinking. However, he then shows this dragon to 3 children who are then burdened with the task of trying to convince Hagrid to let it go, trying to convince him to send this illegal dragon away which cannot possibly live in his tiny hut, especially on school grounds where it could easily be a danger to children. Harry, Ron and Hermione have to work strenuously to convince this man to send the dragon away, and then they have to deliver it themselves, breaking curfew, sneaking to the top of a tower, all on Hagrid's behalf, and then getting caught as a result, losing 150 points for Gryffindor and being given a detention with Hagrid, who then has the gall to tell them, "You've done wrong now and you gotta pay for it." Yeah, I know he's mainly speaking to Draco here, but all the same, why did they do wrong, Hagrid? Who sent them off to do precisely this? Never once are these hypocrisies or flaws pointed out for examination by the story. They're just swept under the rug with this general perspective of Hagrid as a good person. That's so jarring, because having your heart in the right place is not enough for that. It's fundamentally not. People can always have their heart in the right place and yet also be terribly irresponsible to the point of harm. Like the example of the dragon here, if you want to indulge a tangent briefly. Both Both me and Kirsty care a lot about animals. We both have house rabbits, and we know they're the most abandoned and most mistreated pets in the UK because people aren't prepared for the commitment and the responsibility. They just think rabbits look cute and it would be fun to own some. And that because they care about their pet, because they feel love towards it, obviously it's fine, regardless of if they're actually meeting that pet's needs. Are they researching what rabbits require? Are they taking time to understand animals that naturally hide their feelings? Rarely vocalize their needs the way dogs will bark or cats will cry. You have to pay a lot more attention to understand what they're feeling. So you get people who stick them in tiny hutches because they think that's fine, and they never learn to notice any of the subtler signs that their rabbits might be terribly distressed or even sometimes ill. Those people love their pets. They're not intending to cause any harm. Their heart is in the right place. Sometimes they get a little defensive if you question that idea, because obviously they don't want to feel like bad owners. Who does? However, love and good feeling doesn't necessarily mean responsibility and care, nor does it mean you got this pet with a clear, conscious idea of the commitment it requires, which is exactly Hagrid's situation with the dragon. Case in point, keeping a dragon inside a tiny hut is both dangerous to humans and cruel to the dragon. Hagrid wants a dragon because the idea feels fun, thinks he can look after them because he loves dragon, calls himself its mummy. However, he's not prepared for the very serious commitment it requires, dismisses all of those issues with the justification that his heart is in the right place. As a result, you need 3 children to forcefully talk some sense into him. What that all means is Hagrid does not behave in a good manner for a lot of this book. And that's fine if you want to explore his flaws, if that's a point of the story and his arc. We have done that already about his drinking, but at no point is he really criticised about Norbert, or about Harry, Ron and Hermione getting detention. At no point are they annoyed with him about this. What we're then setting up, and what does get worse in the later books, is a man who is utterly irresponsible, being given a lot of responsibility around vulnerable children. It's a problem that gets more and more jarring the longer the story goes on, so we've got to do something about that in book 1. Do something without entirely altering his character, and this is what we do, in my opinion. Just make Hagrid slightly more competent. Please, JK, can he be vaguely responsible at the least? It's another reason I feel he gets unfair characterization, because he is pretty much incompetent at everything he does in the story. I think he could be better than that. How do we do that here? It's tricky. I think my example would be for Hagrid to recognise he's done something stupid with the dragon egg. It's all about the framing of his feelings here. He was drunk when he got it, yes, but in my version he wakes up sober the next day and he thinks, God, what have I done? What do I even do about this? I can't look after a dragon, what was I thinking? I don't think you need the children to forcefully convince him of that fact. I think he should know it already. And so then it's Hagrid who thinks of Ron's brother Charlie Weasley, who works with dragons in Romania. It's Hagrid who first considers that. Maybe we can take Norbert the dragon to him. As a result, he's very eager for Harry, Ron and Hermione to visit his hut so he can start organising this plan, find out from Ron what Charlie Weasley's owl number, location, I don't know how Post works, find out how to contact him. That's what he wants to do, but in the meantime he does still have to look after this dragon. It's irresponsible he got into this situation, but he doesn't want the dragon to die or to not be able to hatch, even if he knows he can't keep it in the long term. And if we need a bit of conflict to this scene, then Ron can be the one who's uneasy about it. He says Charlie can't just go about collecting dragons as favours. Charlie could get in trouble for doing that. Hermione also points out there's paperwork and systems involved. Transferring a dragon should go through the Ministry first, but Hagrid says no. This has to be done secretly. If the Ministry find out Hagrid owned a dragon on school premises, if it's recorded in Charlie's records that that's how he obtained it, that could cost Hagrid his job. Charlie has to collect it secretly, no one can know it came from him, which is still very irresponsible from Hagrid. It's still not good, but the difference is this time we're aware of that fact. The story is pointing it out rather than glossing over it. Yes, that's opening space for these children to argue and complain whine amongst themselves about the shenanigans Hagrid now has got them involved in. Second change to Hagrid is the Forbidden Forest detention, which currently makes no sense. It's bonkers. We're told repeatedly in the book how dangerous the forest is, and yet the staff are now deliberately sending vulnerable children in there. Why? Even worse, they're doing it at a time when Hagrid knows there's something strange out there killing unicorns. Something he hasn't located, doesn't know how dangerous it is, something they're kind of going after. He tells us nothing will attack the kids so long as they're either with him or Fang, but he doesn't know that. He doesn't know what this mystery unicorn killer would do. Also, he still splits the students up, sends half off with Fang to be terrified witless and just hope this random dog is enough to keep them safe. It's utterly ridiculous, but we still need to somehow have it happen because this is the story Joanne wrote. I can't replace this chapter. It also has many important elements for the story. So how do we at least make it a bit more sensible? I think Hagrid insists on supervising this detention. Originally it was meant to be conducted by Filch, but as Filch can ramble to them on the walk to Hagrid's, Hagrid insisted Filch didn't want him to and then only agreed when he realised it meant sending them into the Forbidden Forest, which Filch hopes will terrify them. I'm making that the case. And why did Hagrid insist on running this detention? Well, as he can later explain to Harry, Ron and Hermione in confidence, it's because he felt bad. They got this detention all because of him, because he sent them off trying to deliver a dragon to Charlie that they shouldn't have had to do. He sent them off to get him out of a mess of his own creation. It's his fault, so he at least wanted to make their detention a bit nicer than spending it with Filch. Do you see how well this fits into the existing arc about his drinking, by the way? Hagrid's drinking led him to acquire a dragon egg, and he then pushes 3 kids into this desperate scheme to get him out of the consequences. Not really taking accountability or seriously considering his behaviour, just making a kind but slightly weak attempt of making it up to them by choosing to supervise their detention. It's a little attempt from Hagrid halfway through the book to do better, to acknowledge his behaviour, only it's not enough, and it's then not until the end of the book when Hagrid breaks down and vows to never drink again. That's when he takes his step forward. Which is very simplistic, by the way. I know, it makes it sound like Hagrid can't be a good person unless he stops drinking, but I think the simplicity is probably right for a children's book. I don't think we have the space to explore this in a greater way. Also, I think a lot of those things come down to the actual writing itself and how sensitively you portray it. But giving Hagrid this motivation to supervise the detention, not only does that make it less ridiculous, but it actually strengthens his overall arc. They don't think a trip into the forest at night sounds nice, but no, Hagrid says they've got it all wrong. It's going to be really fun. The task of this detention is going to be helping him feed and track the number of unicorns in the forest. They're beautiful creatures. This is going to be a great treat for you all. That's the other change here. Hagrid doesn't know they're being killed at the point he leads these children in. He thinks this is going to be great. It's still pretty irresponsible to take children in here, but it's slightly less irresponsible now. So they all go in. Hagrid doesn't split them up because that's mad. They all track and find a unicorn, but then, my god, it's dying. Someone attacked it. What's going on? Hagrid finds out about the killings here. He thought, rather stupidly, as he now realises and confesses that detention in the forest was going to be safe. And then what happens? Well, there's signs of the centaurs not being far away, so Hagrid wants to go and ask them about it. But he also needs someone to stay by the unicorn. Maybe feed it some sort of medicinal herb, or just check nothing else happens to it. He's reluctant to leave any of the kids alone without his supervision, but Harry insists he can do that. He can handle it. I can wait by this unicorn, Hagrid. And in reverse, Draco insists on not going with Hagrid because he's heard centaurs are dangerous. He's also had enough of this ridiculous detention and refuses to take another step unless it's to head back. So, fine. Hagrid very reluctantly leaves the two of them with Fang by the unicorn. He promises he won't be long at all, he won't be far, he should still be within earshot. So Harry and Draco then get their scene for character building discussion. Then Quirrell / Voldemort appears to feast on the unicorn before Firenze the Centaur interrupts and Hagrid comes back. Firenze tells us unicorns have been dying most of this school year, but he reveals little else because he's a centaur and that's what they do. Job done. Again, Hagrid is still not the best here, but he's trying a bit harder, it's a bit more sensible, and we're also aware of his faults. What about Quirrell? I hear you screaming at me. That's the question everyone cares about deeply, everyone's favourite, most memorable villain. What do we do about Quirrell? In a way, I probably should have discussed this one in the characterisation section, but it's mostly all to do with being a bad teacher. So, well, firstly, make him not wear a turban, for obvious reasons. Just invent some sort of made-up traditional headpiece that wizards often wear. That's also more interesting from a world-building point of view. Secondly, make him a good teacher. He can still have the very caricature stutter, which I don't entirely like, but I get that makes his nervousness clear to children. I get that's what's trying to be emphasised here. He appears as a man who is perhaps struggling with symptoms of trauma. He can still be very easily startled by, like, loud noises and things. Firstly, why is there no support in place when this man is clearly struggling? I'm kind of amused by a version of this story, like a joke one where Quirrell's plans fail because in carrying out this pretend nervous stuttering act all year to appear innocent, Dumbledore becomes very concerned about Quirrell's well-being and gives him a few months' leave to try and recover, which then prevents him from reaching the Philosopher's Stone. That idea amuses me. Voldemort's plans fail because Quirrell is forced on holiday. No. Let's say Quirrell was a very, very good teacher, and he did take time off to travel, and he came back not quite right with rumours about him encountering vampires. That's what's said to have happened, so let's make that a genuine concern. Quirrell can reveal in his villain monologue at the end that Dumbledore suggested he take a longer break to recover. I don't know if Dumbledore understands trauma, it's never once mentioned in the books, which is weird when you think about it. Either way, Dumbledore suggested he should take a longer leave. Quirrell insisted no, he wants to teach. Obviously he does because his secret Voldemort plan requires being at Hogwarts, but he argues teaching is what will help him feel better. It was at Hogwarts where he felt most himself. And if we wanted, this is going to be quite convoluted, but I think when we get to world building this will make a lot more sense. Dumbledore could even have notified the Board of Governors or the Ministry about Quirrell's well-being. Dumbledore perhaps requesting funds for a secondary part-time Defence Against the Dark Arts teacher to fill in if Quirrell is struggling, but this request is denied. Quirrell is regarded as an extraordinarily good teacher, the Board of Governors don't want him to feel forced out, or they don't have the funds, or whatever. Bureaucracy. I know this all sounds weird right now. The whole question of the Board of Governors and the Ministry's involvement at Hogwarts is a topic we will tackle soon. A topic of discussion that will be much more entertaining than it sounds, I promise you that. We will get there. Either way, Quirrell is here at Hogwarts because he insists on being back and because he is a genuinely good teacher that Harry perhaps quite likes. I think that gives him more layers than just being a man who stutters until he's suddenly revealed to be bad. Snape. Severus Snape.
Dumbledore!
In terms of Snape, we're going to mostly keep him the same. I think he can get away with being horrible to Harry in book 1. I think we can chalk that down as Harry's perspective, especially when Hagrid and McGonagall both explicitly disagree with Harry's view of Snape in book 1. So no, I'm fine with that. I think the problem is if Snape has concerns about Quirrell, saw Quirrell try to kill Harry in a Quidditch match, suspects him of setting a troll loose as a diversion to steal the Philosopher's Stone, if Snape thinks that, why does he never tell Dumbledore or, try to get Quirrell suspended? Why doesn't that happen? That's a really, really hard plot hole to resolve without damaging the story in the process. I'm honestly a bit stuck on this one. I'm intrigued what other people think. My best answer, as I can imagine, though, is that Snape does tell Dumbledore, who does take the warning seriously. However, Snape doesn't know for a fact it was Quirrell bewitching Harry's broom or who let the troll into Hogwarts. God knows how he got a troll past all the supposedly incredible security of Hogwarts. Snape has a hunch, but he doesn't know it's Quirrell. And whilst Dumbledore doesn't think Snape is wrong, they also can't be sure. And that's a problem when it comes to the Board of Governors or the Ministry, who when Dumbledore now reports Snape's concerns about Quirrell, they dismiss them because again Quirrell is an extraordinarily good teacher. They won't suspend a good teacher on hearsay. Snape is known to want the Defence Against the Dark Arts job for himself, so that makes the evidence look suspicious. Also, I don't think the Governors or the Ministry would know about the Philosopher's Stone. I think that's a secret between Dumbledore and Flamel. So the report and explanation Dumbledore can give has to be a bit vague and not the most damning. I think that can all be the case. When it comes to the end of the book and Quirrell Quirrell has his villain monologue about how Snape kept getting in his way, Quirrell can also explain these points. That Snape had reported to Dumbledore and Dumbledore to the Ministry, and Quirrell can then laugh at how much Hogwarts allows him to get away with so long as he's a good teacher. I find that a really fun idea, probably because I'm very dull. That the obvious concerns about Quirrell being a villain are ignored because they depend on his teaching ability. I'm not sure it's the best fix, but it does make a little more sense. If anyone has another idea though, please do comment. Lastly, we have Dumbledore himself, who we have somewhat discussed already. These concerns with him again aren't about characterization so much as about events and what happens at the end of this book and what that says about the teaching at Hogwarts. After Dumbledore speaks to Harry in the hospital, Harry then talks to Ron and Hermione about Dumbledore, and we get this. "Do you think he meant you to do it?" said Ron. "Sending you your father's cloak and everything." This is talking about Harry fighting past the three-headed dog and all of that to confront Voldemort and Quirrell. "Well," Hermione exploded, "if he did, I mean to say, that's terrible. You could have been killed." "No, it isn't," said Harry thoughtfully. "He's a funny man, Dumbledore. I think he sort of wanted to give me a chance. I think he knows more or less everything that goes on here, you know. I reckon he had a pretty good idea we were going to try, and instead of stopping us, he just taught us enough to help. I don't think it was an accident he let me find out how the mirror worked. It's almost like he thought I had the right to face Voldemort, if I could. I think it is awful if Dumbledore intended all of that. A small child had the right to face the murderer who killed his parents and might then kill him, rather than Dumbledore himself solving the problem first. No, just don't have Harry say this. There's plenty of other ways to resolve why he got the cloak or what Dumbledore's been up to, or even just don't say anything at all. They can wonder about it and not answer or know why. Just don't do what we get here. I think it shows an eagerness from Joanne to again make Dumbledore look all-knowing and omniscient and really brilliant, but that comes with moral concerns for why he didn't do more. And I think you could even have Dumbledore make some comment on Harry's heroics in that hospital scene. Some minor joke that shows admiration as well as concern. A kind of, yes, it's very brave that you went and fought Quirrell, but maybe it's not the smartest thing to do. Oh, and also, on the same point of trying to make him too omniscient, let's just alter this. There's the Mirror of Erised scene, where Dumbledore finds Harry looking at the mirror again and tells him to stop coming here so often. Harry asks Dumbledore how he knew he was here, how he knew what Ron saw in the mirror on the previous evening, and Dumbledore says, "I don't need a cloak to become invisible." Maybe this is pedantic, maybe, but does Dumbledore go about the castle secretly spying on people? How many other scenes was he hiding in the background of? Why was he doing this? What's going on? I'm very concerned. My headcanon would be that he has some less sophisticated version of the Marauders map in his office. Something that helps him to have a loose view of what's going on. Although, come to think about it, that comes with then privacy and CCTV type concerns. So alternatively, he could just not need to say, but perhaps he had seen on his map Harry and Ron both visited that room, and he inferred what they'd both see in the mirror based on what he knows about them as people. Not that we would explain any of that. I think it leaves less concerning implications if you just have Dumbledore deflect the question with a bit of humour, not properly answer.
Harry didn't sleep all night. He could hear Neville sobbing into his pillow for what seemed like hours.
The final theme I'm going to mention before we can move on to the next stuff. It's just a very small point, but one I naturally would care about. People aren't very vulnerable in the world of Harry Potter. Or when they are, it's often for a level of ridicule, people framed as hysterical or overly sensitive, where a lack of vulnerability is often seen as a good thing. In the first book, this isn't too bad, admittedly. In the later books, I think it is. It gets very bad. And we're not going to get into examples with the later books, but I think we should be careful to make sure book one doesn't start us down that road, you know? This is again to do with planting the seeds. So the examples we have here are minor for book one, but sometimes I feel like the story wants us to laugh at Hagrid's sensitivity. You can fix this just in the way a single scene is framed. For example, as I mentioned before, we can tweak the ending so that his tears about Harry's possible death are taken more seriously. I think that's important. I think that's enough for book one. I think Ron apologising to Hermione after she's been crying in the girls' bathroom, I think that's also important, because without that, I think there is an accidental implication that Hermione has just been being ridiculous and overly emotional emotional, which is unfair, especially when all of these characters are 11-year-old children. Of course they're going to cry a lot. You know, I can remember full-on crying around that age because I couldn't manage to gel my hair the way I wanted to. Neville is the main one who gets it, though. Lots of descriptions of him bursting into tears. He's not very brave and he's bad at most subjects and very clumsy. Yes, we know that, and he does actually get something of an arc there for the later books. I'm glad about that. However, all of those points combined with all of the talk about him bursting into tears does just give it a slight flavour that the narrative is criticising Neville as being, like, weak or something. That he needs to get a grip of himself, you know? To fix this, I don't think we need to actually change how Neville behaves. I think he's fine and all of that. It's more how these events are framed. Harry and the narration in general is very indifferent to his upset. Like, take these two examples. Harry didn't sleep all night. He could hear Neville sobbing into his pillow for what seemed like hours. Neville had been sobbing into Hagrid's jacket for what seemed like 5 minutes. There's no sense of sympathy or empathy from Harry on the narration itself. It's just a kind of sense that we're timing Neville on how much he cries to judge how bad the situation is, you know? This is just a typical thing Neville does that we should kind of accept and sort of ignore without much attention. I do love that Neville does have an arc in this book where he learns to stand up for himself more. But when Harry, Ron and Hermione are getting angry with him for not doing that at the start of this book, and also actually angry when he does stand up for himself, that and the fact there is never any real empathy for the times when he is upset, it makes it feel like the vulnerability is an inherently bad thing, which, speaking as a children's therapist about a book for children, I think that kind of idea is a problem. So just reframe some of these moments the tiniest amount to show Harry feeling a little sad for Neville. Maybe him or someone else explicitly offering him comfort in some of those moments. And alongside that, I think a little moment where Harry himself cries in this book. It doesn't really matter where, there's lots of situations where an 11-year-old boy in a crazy school wrought with dangers and bullying, there's tons of moments he might cry. But I just think if we let our brave hero do that at some point as a normal thing that happens, I think that would help a lot. If I had to pick one moment where he could cry, I would say it's when Hagrid gives him the photo album with pictures of his parents. Have Harry properly start crying at the sight of them, and Hagrid actually comfort him for once, like he's the adult he's supposed to be. I think that kind of moment between them could be really, really wholesome. So, you know, vulnerability is important. Yeah, there are often some good reasons not to cry or break down in certain situations. Good times to not be too vulnerable, to hold back a little bit. However, that isn't all of the time. Never doing that would be unhealthy for everyone. Being able to express vulnerability is never a mark of weakness, and if an 11-year-old boy isn't allowed to cry, even considering all of the trauma he has put through, then who is? Generally, though, that concludes our section on theme. I don't know what the lesson is we're learning here in terms of writing. I think it's probably just to reflect and analyse your stories, to pay attention to the themes that might unintentionally creep into your writing or the unwanted patterns. For example, I don't think Harry not being described showing any comfort or concern for Neville's tears is because JK wrote it so that he doesn't care. I don't think she wanted Harry to come across incompassionate. I think she just wanted to get on with the story. Neville's tears are just a throwaway line to show how sad it is that they lost 150 points or whatever. She's not intending anything bad here, but it can kind of happen and build up as a bit of a pattern across the whole books. Writing is a form of communication, and sometimes you miscommunicate if you're not careful. To an extent, that's inevitable. I know that exact problem with my own writing, and sometimes you are overanalyzing it and doubting yourself too much. How will this come across? Have I done this wrong? But self-doubt is still an important tool in a writer's kit, even if it is very uncomfortable and you have to learn not to be too harsh on yourself with it, but doubt can help you spot potential problems, and I think the more we can accept doubt as a part of the general writing process, the less daunted and demotivated it will leave us. And yeah, in terms of what we said about cruelty, about teaching, I would say sometimes let theme be the answer to your plot hole problems. Why doesn't Snape try to get Quirrell suspended? Why does Harry keep on living with the Dursleys? My answer answer is basically because the systems are flawed and that whole fact is something interesting to explore, you know? If your answer to plot hole questions can be something meaningful to explore within itself, something characters can react to and have ideas and feelings about, that's going to feel a much more organic answer because it's an answer that opens outwards, offers more space for story, rather than an answer that shuts things down, that just says, this is why this thing doesn't happen, so forget about it, move along. So yeah, to be clear on that, I think I could say the examples I've given are outwards answers to those plot hole questions, where one that would shut it down would be, for example, in book 5, I think it is. There's been this big plot hole question of why don't they use the time turners to do X, Y, Z. J.K. Rowling answers that question by having them accidentally break all of the time turners in the world when they're going through the Ministry of Magic. That's an inward answer. That's one that doesn't lead to more story. And it's quite a bad answer, you know? All of that, I think, leads us nicely into a discussion about world building now. That's the bit of this video I find the most fun. I've been looking forward to getting here. World building! So, there's rather a lot to do here. I think the world building of Harry Potter is a bit of a contradiction. It's both Joanne's strongest and weakest aspect when it comes to her writing. Although I think I said something earlier was her weakest aspect. I think I might say that a lot. But she comes up with some stuff that is great. I mean it with no hint of irony when I say Bertie Bott's all flavoured beans is a thing of genius. It means absolutely nothing in the story, there's no depth or complexity to it, but it's just a little thing that's fun. Very easily excites a child's imagination as they get to wonder about all the weird flavours, have a laugh about the idea of a bogey flavoured bean or cow dung or whatever else. Sometimes it's the little things that just make a world feel real, and if not real, then at least fun. Joanne is good at that. You could say this for a lot of the world. Staircases that move, they make no sense, they're a nightmare of a health hazard, but it's a fun idea. It's visually striking. People going in and out of paintings and photo frames. A cigarette lighter that puts out and reignites lamplights in the street. Chocolate frogs that hop away if you're not quick. It's all completely stupid, but that's part of the fun. And I'm a great advocate for that. I think don't be afraid to make your world just a little bit stupid at times. If that's the tone for your story, if that's what you want to go for, then do go for it. And it's no accident Harry Potter was so massively successful despite the many flaws in the world building that we are going to discuss. Despite all of that, people do just want to exist in that world. It's an admirably successful mix of idealised boarding school wish fulfillment and fun ideas that do just pop. It works despite all the issues, and we do have to give it praise for that. However, I think world building issues are still a problem, a big problem. It does work here, but only providing the reader is willing to overlook the faults in order to buy into the magic. I think the more you read Harry Potter, the more the world does just seem like a smokescreen of Bertie Botts and rooms of requirement and fun, interesting things that paper over a strange absence. And I know we said this earlier about characters and their lack of arcs, but whatever changes in the wizarding world apart from Voldemort dying? Also, as much as I do say don't be afraid to make your world a bit dumb at times, the wizarding world is still bonkers. So bonkers it does break your immersion and does become jarring, especially in the later, older books. All of the madness these people seem to accept without a bat of their eyes. Although, again, the biggest problems aren't actually the world-building decisions themselves. It's not actually the bonkers stuff Joanne decided should exist. A lot of that is actually in the later books, which means we're not going to discuss it now. We're not going to be tackling the whole problem of house elves or goblins. I suppose goblins do appear in the Philosopher's Stone, but it's not really a big point here. Mainly, it's the stuff Joanne never made exist. All of the empty space. Once the wish fulfillment wears off, what about these books do fulfill you? So, I'm going to provide a few examples of the sort of things that could be there. Not everything, because honestly we could go on forever. We could make a 10-hour video just about this. And whilst many of the things I'm going to suggest are going to be general things for all of the books, I am also mainly just thinking of these things based on the first book. Rereading them. I'm only up to A Prisoner of Azkaban right now, so my world-building thoughts only go as far as being stimulated by that, and from what I remember of the later books. Also, there's not going to be much discussion about how you actually include these world building elements. You know, like coming up with the ideas is just one half of world building. The other half, and the most important bit that people barely ever talk about, is how you weave that stuff into the story, how you introduce all this knowledge about the world in a way that's engaging and organic and works. That is the most important bit, but we're not going to discuss that too much. I may offer some hints because I do have some thoughts about this, but we're not going to go in depth on that because it would just be too long. Let's just get started.
So old Cornelius Fudge got the job. Bungler if ever there was one. So he pelts Dumbledore with owls every morning asking for advice.
I won't lie, I don't entirely understand the school system of Hogwarts. As far as I can tell, the headmaster pretty much has free rein to do whatever he wants. However, there are a board of governors who can suspend teachers should they wish to. Though not to hire teachers, Dumbledore seems to do that, and we don't see any regulation of the curriculum or other involvement from the board of governors, who may or may not be connected to the ministry. I can't tell if they're independent from the ministry, but happen to have some individuals on the board who also work at the ministry, like Lucius Malfoy, or if the Hogwarts Board of Governors are a branch within the Ministry of Magic. I don't know. I hope someone super nerdy here can answer in the comments, but either way, Dumbledore can largely do whatever he wants, and the Ministry has next to no involvement. Even in the second book, when Cornelius Fudge turns up to take Hagrid to Azkaban because they think he unleashed the monster, even then, that's a case of arresting someone rather than suspending teachers. Dumbledore being forced to step down in that book briefly as headmaster is orchestrated entirely by Lucius Malfoy from within the Board of Governors. Beyond that, the Ministry do nothing until Dolores Umbridge in the fifth book starts regulating things, which is a change in policy then and is seen as a bad thing in the books. The government should not interfere with school business, apparently. Conveniently, Dolores Umbridge happens to be a bad person who makes a lot of stupid rules, but Dolores Umbridge could have easily been well within her rights to take issue with the health and safety nightmare of Hogwarts, or some of the terrible teachers, or what the f*** is wrong with the subjects themselves? Like, there's very few subjects you look at and think, yep, I can see how that's important for career prospects or general preparation for the adult world. I'm sorry, I know it's pedantic, and it just happens to be a sore spot of mine because I work in schools as a children's therapist, and we're taught to be alert to safeguarding concerns and how abuse can happen even within school systems. So the idea that the government just goes, yep, do whatever you want, Dumbledore, that seems genuinely frightening to me. So much horror would take place within Hogwarts had Dumbledore not luckily been a very good person. And even then, so much horror still takes place. It's so weird in the second book when Ginny Weasley very nearly dies, largely because Dumbledore decided not to close the school when the basilisk attacks first started happening. Molly and Arthur Weasley almost lose their daughter and not once take any issue with Dumbledore's running of the school. They consistently, passionately see him as the best possible headmaster. What? Yeah, these books have an uncomfortable accidental theme that government interference is bad. And like, don't get me wrong, it can be bad. It can obviously be very bad. The government itself is a system that can be very easily corrupted. It can also slow things down and tie things up in bureaucracy. However, that doesn't mean the idea of government is bad as a whole. There are still systems for a reason. You can't just declare all government involvement a bad thing. Apart from Umbridge, the only other person who really takes any issue with the way the school is run is Lucius Malfoy, who again is conveniently evil. We're supposed to see all of his concerns as bad, where instead we're taught to have blind loyalty towards our great and magical leader, regardless of what he does, and it is all a bit cult-like, don't you think? God knows what Muggle parents must think when their children disappear to some secret school and they hear rumours about people almost dying every year and they're supposed to just accept it. I should stop ranting though. How do we fix this stuff without A, changing the story in massive ways, and B, without removing a lot of the fun? You know, ridiculous danger is fun in a light-hearted story. Harry Potter would be boring were there not krakens in the lake and trolls in the dungeons. We don't want to get rid of that stuff, we just want to have it make a bit more sense. And the solution, like kind of most of my solutions have been for this video so far, is basically let characters take issue with this. I do want a much more involved Ministry of Magic. I want a representative from the Ministry whose job it is to regularly make sure Hogwarts meets certain standards. Let's just call that character the Inspector for now. How I picture them is basically Cornelius Fudge, an easily flustered person who struggles to stand up to Dumbledore at times. Or maybe like Mr. Poe from the series of Unfortunate Events books. Someone a bit like that. If you introduce a character who represents this kind of stuff, the issues people have with the Hogwarts school, you then get to play about with that as an idea, and it then gets to have a bit more sense because it is a thing that's happening. So all you have to do is have this inspector pop up at times where it's most comically suitable and have him throw a bit of a fit. Let's call him, I don't know, Mr. Ainsley? Mr. Ainsley is an exasperated inspector who comes bursting in after getting hundreds of letters from parents talking about some sort of troll in the dungeon. Dumbledore, what is going on? You know, no doubt Joanne would exaggerate this character to the absolute max, and he'd be on the edge of fainting at all times when anything happens. I heard students ended up dealing with the troll in the dungeons themselves, Dumbledore. First years at that. Where were the teachers at the time? What, most of you arrived late, and Snape was... What? Snape was tending to a wound on his leg from fighting a three-headed dog? Why is there a three-headed dog on the premises? Dumbledore, this can't be true. Not that that would be actual dialogue, that's just a general idea of the kind of things you can poke fun at with this character. You could have so much fun with them, and it benefits the story on several levels. Firstly, yes, because in the story poking fun at the madness itself, I think we're also encouraged to have fun with the madness. We're encouraged to accept it as something we can laugh at rather than something that breaks immersion. Secondly, it's going to help Dumbledore stop looking like so terrible a person when he's meant to be good, because there can now be very specific instances where Dumbledore's judgment is overruled. For example, and this is book 2, but why the hell does Dumbledore appoint a woefully incompetent and morally questionable Gilderoy Lockhart to teach vulnerable children when Dumbledore knows him to be a fraud? Why does he do that? The answer we're given is that we're supposed to believe Dumbledore wants to expose Lockhart as a fraud, but apparently giving him a job at a school and damaging students' education is a better way of exposing his frauds than, like, investigative journalism. And Dumbledore thinks it's fine for the students because they would have a lot to learn from him in the sense of how not to behave. That logic is just, like, what are you talking about, Dumbledore? That's a really bad explanation for why Lockhart is there. So, no. We've got Mr. Ainsley now. We just say he reported a lot of concerns to the Ministry about Quirrell, how he turned out to be a Voldemort supporter. How did you not know that when you hired him, Dumbledore? How could you have let this happen? Of course, this is hypocritical. That's also the fun, because I'm having Dumbledore in book 1 write to the Ministry with concerns about Quirrell, and the Ministry overlooking that because they value him as a great teacher at the time. And then in book 2, the Ministry goes, no, you shouldn't have hired him, Dumbledore. You did a bad job there, so we're going to hire the next teacher for you. We think Lockhart looks like the perfect man for the job. What do you mean he's a fraud, Dumbledore? Of course he isn't. Have you not read his books? We really think Lockhart will do well. We're taking the decision here. So, more government involvement allows Dumbledore to look a bit more competent by virtue of bad decisions now being made by other people. And thirdly, this is again helping us to better explore the theme of how systems can fail. Which, by the way, is really important. The whole books are technically about a villain being able to corrupt and take over an entire governmental system. So I feel like the early books should set that up a bit by demonstrating how flawed and incompetent the systems currently are. Mr. Ainsley, who would definitely deserve a better name, by the way, is a vehicle for all of this, as the only person in this entire system with the clear focus and priority of student safety. The only person, and yet he's woefully incompetent, easily flustered and brushed aside, and never truly understands the students he's supposed to be helping. Hence, he ignores concerns when he shouldn't do, takes the wrong action when he needs to make a decision, and then sometimes we can also have the reverse of this. Let me explain. It is a little bit confusing, however not all of this would need explaining in book 1. We're just going to explain it for the sake of it here. What we do is we keep the Board of Governors, of which this Ministry Inspector Mr. Ainsley is one figure among them. His job entitles him to a seat at that board. However, the rest of the people on that board are independent people who gained their position via old traditions, basically. Hogwarts is a very old school. Its governors can be descendants of ex-headmasters or families that donated generously to the school and that kind of stuff. So that means we've got one ministry official in Mr. Ainsley whose job it is to be concerned about school standards, and then like 11 other people who can be very antiquated in their outlook, very passionate about classic traditions. And they block things quite often. Stuff that either Mr. Ainsley is suggesting or even Dumbledore himself wants to change. They think Quidditch should remain a compulsory subject at Hogwarts, despite the fact there's only 7 players to a team and there's lots of students who take interest in other weird sports we could invent. We definitely need other sports in the Wizarding world. Or maybe even some muggle sports like football that might actually provide proper exercise. There's a lot of students who are interested in playing that at Hogwarts, but nope, the board is having none of that because Quidditch is traditional. The board think Peeves the Poltergeist should remain at Hogwarts despite basically just making everything worse for everyone because he's been there for hundreds of years. We can now have it as canon that Dumbledore has been fighting against this board his entire tenure as headmaster, trying to change things and really struggling to because of this board. I don't want to be too drastic with this stuff, certainly not in book 1, but I do kind of like the idea that Dumbledore, for example, has some concerns about the school housing system and the ways Slytherin students are looked at as a result of it, and he kind of wants to get rid of the houses altogether, only the Board of Governors would never allow that because that's tradition, that's how the school was founded. I quite like that idea. It might be a bit much, but you get the general sense of the kind of conflicts we can have now. Not only is that really interesting, but you can use it as a bit of a get out of jail free card for every time something stupid happens in the stories. You can use it for humour with Mr. Ainsley, and you get to explore the problems within a system built on tradition and antiquated ideas, and how archaic principles often get in the way of important progress.
It was ever such a surprise when I got my letter, but I was ever so pleased, of course. I mean, it's the very best school of witchcraft there is.
Here's something I want to fix straight away. I want there to be other wizarding schools in the UK. We all know Joanne had the most ludicrous world building for the wizarding schools of the world. 11 schools for the entire world, and at best it's just stupid, and at worst it's culturally offensive. The UK gets 1 school, and so does all of South America, all of North America. Largely, the schools are split into continents regardless of different religious and cultural beliefs within those continents, and then the UK gets its own separate place because, I guess, colonialism. Long live the British Empire. It's mad. We need more schools. Lots more schools. So many that Joanne wouldn't have to even fret about inventing school names like Castello Bruxo for the South American school. It appears there that she just typed Wizard Castle into Google Translate for Brazilian Portuguese, and then gave it no greater thought. If there is anyone who understands Portuguese, is this even accurate? Like, I could be wrong because all I know of languages apart from English is some Italian, and if Portuguese is at all similar, then I feel like there's a word missing in the middle to indicate that it is a castle of wizards or a castle for wizards, rather than Castello Bruxo meaning that this is a castle that is also a wizard. Similarly, shouldn't the word wizard here be plural? I can guess that something like Castello dos Bruxos would be more accurate, and I don't even know Portuguese. But you know who does know Portuguese, apparently? J.K. Rowling. That's a tangent though, and the point I was trying to make is that there should be hundreds of schools, thousands, too many to name. Make, at the absolute least, 30 different schools in the UK alone. Why is this so important? Well, like with many of these changes, I was at first making them for reasons of solving a plot hole or some strange inconsistency in the world. However, it is in adding fixes like this you actually do get to strengthen the story in ways that aren't necessarily obvious to begin with, but definitely make a difference. But if we start with the plot hole first, or it's not even technically a plot hole, but I find it weird that whilst the Ministry has barely any involvement at Hogwarts, this is still a state-funded school. All UK wizards seem to automatically obtain a place at Hogwarts provided they can prove their magical ability. The Ministry organises all of that for them, funds all of these students, and then just steps back to let Dumbledore do whatever the hell. No. Make Hogwarts a private school. It's so obviously modelled on private schools anyway, so just make it one. Make it the only private school in the UK, perhaps. The oldest school as well. And because of the history it has and the tradition and past alumni, Hogwarts is considered to be one of the best schools ever. Its headmaster is a bona fide celebrity. Hogwarts is the elite place to get an education. That's a thing people can think. And because it's now a private school, it makes some sense that the Ministry has less jurisdiction and the Board of Governors and other donors to the school gets more influence over the way it's run. So make Hogwarts private, however, then I think there should be state-funded schools in the UK as well. The problem here is both stigma against them, because, like, who wouldn't want to go to the school that produced such wizards as Dumbledore, is run by arguably the best wizards in the world in Dumbledore, people can think that, and secondly, the Ministry of Magic can be a mess, and the state schools are dismally underfunded and therefore inconsistent in the quality of education they would provide. This stuff is all important and we're all building to it, but have you ever seen that Key and Peele sketch about the inner city wizarding school?
Barnabas Jackson, principal here at Clortho. Vince Clortho High.
There's a bunch of stuff that we confiscated just this week. Here's a wand with a silencer on it. Why? But I ask again, why?
We may not have a huge endowment like they get over at Hogwarts. And yes, some of the teachers have to buy their own newt's eyes or bat wings.
One kid got transformed into a cat. They can't even afford a changing back.
This young man's name is Jamar.
It's a really fun sketch, but it also would basically be really good world building for the Harry Potter books. Like, there's really interesting story here. Who wouldn't want to see an entire series set at this school? So it just makes sense to have a bit of conflict, you know? World building is most alive when there are conflicts within your world. Vague mentions about other state-funded schools and a prejudice against them from those at the elite Hogwarts. I think the fun kind of irony you can create where Hogwarts is properly funded and has great facilities and supplies, and they can request funds to apparently order a student a Nimbus 2000 when he's earned a place on the Gryffindor team. That's all great. However, they also have a lot of issues created by a board of governors refusing to change traditions. And then state schools, in reverse, can be terribly funded and suffer with overworked teachers, but also sometimes be a lot more progressive in their teaching methods and just generally safer than Hogwarts. I think that's a really fun contrast. And we're again exploring issues with the wizarding world. How things are sometimes unfair in the world, and how a group of kids growing up might at first not recognise that. Our main characters might just enjoy the privilege of being at Hogwarts. But there is also an issue here with the education systems. Issues our main characters might grow up to care a lot about, might one day want to change. There we go. Change. The thing you need to happen in a world for it to feel alive. The thing you need your characters to care about and fight for. Currently, the one thing we do see Hermione fight for with House Elf rights, the story frames that as a bad thing, that Hermione's so stupid, haha, these elves really like slavery, change is bad, you shouldn't fight for it, it's annoying for you to do that, preserve the status quo. That's a big problem. If you don't have change and you don't have characters who care about change, also in a reverse, some characters who don't want change to happen and the conflict between those two, without that, where's the story? Also, indulge me in a tangent on wizard population because simple numbers tell us we need more schools. Hogwarts is canonically supposed to have around 1,000 students. I can't remember how I found that out. I'm going to try and find out again so I can show you the source, but that just does not add up, because as far as we're ever shown, each year has one class for each house. A Gryffindor class, a Slytherin, a Hufflepuff, and a Ravenclaw. So that's like 1,000 students divided by 4, which gives us 250, then divided by 7 for each year group, so that gives us about 38 students per class. However, potentially more than that per class, because a lot of the students won't stay on for 6th and 7th years, so it's not technically divided by 7. If we divided it by 5 instead, that's 50 students per class. So we got somewhere between 38 and 50 students that are then almost always paired up with another class for lessons. Like we see Harry having double potions with the Slytherin class, or herbology with the Hufflepuff. So that's now like between 76 and 100 students per lesson, which is a lot. But in terms of the characters we're given and the descriptions of lessons, there's no way the classes are anywhere near that size. No way. I'd guess there's at most like 30 in a class of doubled houses. So that's 15 students per house per year. Otherwise, it would also mean there's 200 250 people in the Gryffindor common room, by the way, which would need to be absolutely massive to accommodate them all. Either we need massive classes and massive dormitories, or we need to mention there being more classes for each house, like a first year Gryffindor A and Gryffindor B, or we just have more schools and make less people go to Hogwarts. Not many people get into Hogwarts because it's an elite private school. Most other people have to go to badly funded state schools. This can be interesting. I like the idea that rather than every year Hogwarts Quidditch matches just being held between the houses, I'd like it that they also have some matches against other schools in the UK or the nearby region, even if that's just on rare occasions. Gryffindor plays a match against this random school that's vaguely nearby, and Hogwarts teams almost always win because they have better brooms. However, sometimes, just sometimes, we get to see state-funded school students excel and win a match despite their handicap. That's something you can just describe happening as a general summary. This isn't a major thing we're introducing, by the way, it's just something you can slip into a few paragraphs, but it builds the world and adds to the theme, particularly when it comes to the Weasleys. In my version, Harry Potter receives a letter for Hogwarts, or rather, loads of letters for Hogwarts, because he comes from a traditional wizarding family and his parents previously went there. As such, he is automatically offered a place, provided he isn't a Squib. We'll come to Squibs later, but he takes the trip with Hagrid to his Gringotts vault, which enables him to pay the tuition fee. After that, he gets to go to Hogwarts. Hermione, however, is not automatically guaranteed a place because she's not from a traditional wizarding family. There's a problem I'm inventing here about the antiquated ways Hogwarts acquires its students. Hermione isn't automatically granted a place, however, due to her Muggle school grades and a test of her magic being carried out at which she absolutely excels, or perhaps just an application letter she writes with a very good essay that shows off her intellect, I think because of her excellent abilities she is able to get herself a place, which would actually add to her general motivations at Hogwarts to be so eager to study and do so well. So that's quite good for Hermione's character. And then Ron. Ron is automatically offered a place because he's a traditional wizarding family, however his parents struggle with the tuition fees, especially when they've already had Fred, George, Percy, Charlie and Bill go through Hogwarts. And whilst they have been helped by some scholarships that might exist, because they are a low income but also again traditional wizarding family, that's some of the favouritism going on in the wizarding system. Whilst that's the case, there is still a cost they have to pay, and by the time they've gotten to Ron, it's touch and go about whether they can afford to commit 5 to 7 years of tuition fees for him. Ron, in my version, very nearly doesn't get to go to Hogwarts, save for Bill agreeing to scrape some money together he can send to help with those costs, all of which can factor into why Ron feels so overshadowed by his brothers and why his family's wealth is such a sore spot. Because that's supposed to be a theme in the books to an extent, via the Weasleys. Poverty. And whilst it's genuinely great to see how good these people are, how close and warm a family they are, we also never really get a real or serious sense about the stresses of poverty for the Weasley family. It all gets glossed over, and that's kind of a shame, I think. I would like some sense of the very serious and real impacts of poverty, and I think the idea that Ron almost didn't get to go to Hogwarts. Yeah, I think Ron would have a little bit of a chip on his shoulder here. I think how easily he can picture himself in one of the state-funded school Quidditch teams. I think that could be difficult for him. I really like the idea of Ron at Hogwarts watching Gryffindor play a Quidditch match against one of these state-funded teams and batter them. Ron just seeing that and easily imagine how he could have ended up on that state-funded team. Him getting to wonder how easily he might never have met Harry or Hermione and how that feels to him. How Malfoy can tease him about it if he ever finds out that Ron almost didn't get in. So much more character work you can do with Ron just as a result of this one world-building change. And I should be clear, state education is not a bad thing. Both my parents worked in state education. I have worked in it. I strongly believe in it despite its many obstacles. I don't want to make this sound like I have some kind of chip on my shoulder. Not getting to go to Hogwarts because it's expensive is hardly the sob story of the decade. Potentially it's a good thing. And I also know it sounds kind of ridiculous. Like, I literally said a second ago, we're getting to explore some of the difficulties of poverty via the Weasleys, and then that was my example. That's like some real Tory answer from me there. That's like Rishi Sunak saying that underprivileged means not having Sky TV. No, obviously we could explore poverty diversity in a lot better ways than that. I would like to imagine that we would do that in the later books. However, Ron is still entitled to feel upset about the prospect of not attending Hogwarts, because that's still his perspective. He is from a low-income family, but also technically privileged as a pure-blood family who has grown up in this world and has all sorts of expectations around attending Hogwarts. The idea this could be a sore spot and that he could have a chip on his shoulder about state schools makes a lot of sense, and also opens up space for some interesting character progression later down the line. How might Ron change and develop in regards to these things? I think there's so much space to enrich his character just by occasionally making mention of other schools. Oh, and also, maybe it's like one way to explain the fact why 95% of Hogwarts students are white. Maybe there's also a little bit of systemic racism going on here, because honestly, the only non-white students I can think of, maybe I've missed some, but are Angelina Johnson, Dean Thomas, Lee Jordan, Cho Chang, and then Padma and Parvati Patil. 6 characters in a school of apparently 1,000. Only one of them being vaguely important to the story. I think especially when Hogwarts is supposed to be a school for all UK wizards, this kind of lack of diversity does actually reflect very badly on Joanne as a writer. She later tried to argue that maybe Hermione was black all along, actually, when she was criticised about this, but that's A, an argument that doesn't match with book descriptions of Hermione, and B, is a weak sort of retroactive point scoring, like announcing Dumbledore was gay after the books, when nothing in them suggests it, so people might not ever know, and it doesn't get to mean anything. You could probably do a tweak and make some of the main characters black. I don't know if I'd do that or not. I think we could discuss this in a section about diversity at the end of the video. You could do that. You could also make the world building about how white Hogwarts is, make that an actual point, make that mean something about the institution itself. And, like, if you feel a light-hearted children's story about a magic school isn't the right book to explore systemic racism, or even has enough space to do so, that's very understandable, but I think a single sentence could just express this idea fine. A single sentence to at least subtly float the idea about how everyone is white and maybe there's a problem. That would at least be better than nothing.
Why on earth did Filch want a quick spell course? Did this mean he wasn't a proper wizard?
Here's another reason to have other schools besides Hogwarts in the UK, and obviously in the rest of the world as well. But we're focusing on the UK because obviously that's all we see in book 1. Another reason for more schools is because what the hell do Squibs do? Squibs are non-magical children of wizarding families. So they grow up in the wizarding world, aware of all of this magic. Their parents relentlessly hoping they'll show some signs of magic themselves. However, they get to the age of 11, there's still nothing. Therefore, they don't get accepted into Hogwarts by whatever tests and measures this is discovered through. They are refused a place. The school is only for the magical children and only for the best. I guess that makes sense, but then what do these children do instead? I mean, they haven't been going to Muggle schools all this time, and now they're not allowed education at the only magic school there is, so they just don't get any education? That's it? Particularly unfair because not all classes at Hogwarts even require magic. As far as I can tell, I don't know, is it needed for herbology? For a history of magic? I'm not even sure things like ancient runes would require it. Like, maybe you can argue carving rune staves requires magic, but that's still something we in the Muggle world know about, and people do. So if that's something the Muggles can learn about, like, surely Squibs are at least entitled to understand runes? Squibs need to go somewhere. My suggestion to solve this is that the other state-funded schools do accept Squibs, even if Hogwarts doesn't. Squibs get to attend magic schools. They still get to learn how magic works, taught the knowledge to spot what certain spells are. I think that's very important for a Squib to at least understand this stuff, even if they can't perform it themselves, to know what the killing curse is, what it looks like, to spot the signs of someone under the Imperious curse, to sense when certain objects are charmed and what you should do to avoid dangers there. This feels like stuff they should at least know about, and that then requires some kind of education. And either you can say we now have special Squib-only schools, or you can say that some schools just have it as policy that they do accept Squibs as well. And I think I prefer that option because I think it raises more conflict within the world building. Schools that choose to accept Squibs are arguably more progressive and inclusive than ones that don't. However, it's also culturally sneered at by many as a mark of a bad school. And And we can then add even more spice to this if we want. Here's something that can get explained in a later book. Historically, no schools accepted squibs. Historically, they were treated very badly, and it was a progressive law to try and introduce places in schools for squibs. However, that law was met with a lot of resistance. As a result, it's never been made compulsory that all state schools have to accommodate squibs. It's something schools can choose to do or not to do, but the ones that do accept squibs receive extra grants from the ministry as a result. So it's kind of then a nice dilemma for these schools. You get extra funding to improve your school, but you also potentially damage its reputation, because there is still an unfair tendency for people to look down on schools that accept squibs. I think, again, there's just a lot of different stuff you can play around with there within the story. You don't have to play around with it, you don't have to make that integral to the story development, but it's something there that could be used. And by the way, all of this does raise the question of what education wizards' children have in general before the age of 11. Because it's 11 when they go to Hogwarts. Before then, do they have any education? Are they just left to spend time at home? Despite the fact many parents might be at work and might not be able to afford parenting for them during the days. I can't find any mention of wizarding primary or elementary schools, so I assume they don't exist, and that's really weird. Maybe just mention somewhere in one of the books that they do exist, that Ron did go to a primary school, and even if they're not yet taught magic at that age, he could have been taught other just generally important things like maths, like reading and writing, things real schools do teach us for a reason.
It all comes down to blood, as I was saying the other day. Bad blood will out.
Yep, this is another thing at least worth mentioning. This world-building chapter just keeps on going. It could have a near infinite amount of sections, but this one isn't something I originally thought of until a friend pointed it out to me, and now I can't get it out of my head. Genetics is a really weird thing in Harry Potter. Also a big theme in the overall story, criticising ideas of purebloods, eugenics, how through breeding you can create a more perfect population. The story criticises how immoral and ludicrous that all is, which I obviously agree with. Eugenics is obviously a horrible thing that also raises an obvious question of what is a better human anyway? Is that intrinsically tied to racist beliefs? I am glad Harry Potter does criticise all of that. However, here's the thing. Eugenics is not just immoral, it's also wrong, like scientifically inaccurate. So ideally we'd have a story saying not only is this stuff bad for very obvious moral reasons, but it doesn't even work anyway. It's just a bunch of peddling racist beliefs. That's the bit Harry Potter doesn't do. And largely I think that's down to an accidental error in Joanne's world building more than anything greater. Because eugenics kind of does work in the wizarding world. Magic is something genetically passed down here. There is the magic gene that squibs might miss out on and certain muggles might get lucky with, but generally breeding to wizards will pass down magic and breeding to muggles will not. And obviously as well, magic is a thing muggles genetically cannot do. No matter how hard they trained, the same as squibs, they can't learn it, but it is something wizards can do. I think we could take issue with that fact. And there's a lot of talk in the books that Muggle-born wizards can be just as good at magic as half-bloods or pure-bloods. Yes, but there is still something slightly odd going on here, because Muggles will never be good at magic, and that's genetic fact in the story. In different words, someone like Voldemort would probably describe that as the flaw of an inferior species, and none of that is what J.K. Rowling is intending to say. It's what she's trying to criticise, but the world building also makes it look like eugenics isn't scientifically inaccurate. It's almost like she's accidentally suggesting it's true. I do think it becomes a problem. I think there's so much talk in Harry Potter about bad bloods or dirty blood, which we're told people shouldn't say or believe, but at the same time we get Arthur Weasley looking down on muggles like some exhibit in a zoo. Hagrid himself talks about bad blood. It's really hard to write a story where some people are genetically wizards and some people genetically aren't, and to not have it creep into some dodgy waters at some point. And then the problem, of course, is how do you fix this without completely altering the fabric of everything in the story? And I don't know. I'm stuck. My best fallback plan would be to kind of make this beliefs rather than scientific proof. Make it so that wizards do commonly believe magic is a genetic component that can be passed down via breeding. That, like, even the Weasleys believe this, even though they're not as extreme as the Malfoys. However, have it also in the world that this belief is wrong. It is an inaccurate, outdated belief that wizards are only just recently starting to understand. Which raises the question, technically, anyone can learn to perform magic. Raises the question of, is the biggest thing that's been holding muggles back for hundreds of years not a genetic difference, but the fact they don't actually know magic is possible. They don't know to try and learn. Whether or not you answer that question, I think it's a kind of interesting philosophical thing to just raise in the books. Probably not in book 1, but this is all setting the ground. And like, maybe there is a genetic component, sure, but maybe magic is also down to a lot of other factors too. Maybe wizards and muggles being completely distinct people is a bit of a myth. Maybe part of the growing argument for schools to accept squibs is built out of this growing idea that magic isn't so clear-cut as people previously believed. Like, maybe. It would certainly strengthen the themes in the story to do with genetics, but it's also very complicated. This is a lot to be adding in. I think this means later books might involve muggles who do learn magic. That's a lot of stuff to change down the line when I haven't even envisioned how that would look, so I don't know if this is right. I just think it's worth mentioning so you can either shoot it down in the comments or tell me I'm onto something. Let's move on.
What does a Ministry of Magic do? Well, their main job is to keep it from the muggles that there's still witches and wizards up and down the country.
The Statute of Secrecy is the law that all wizards need to be kept secret from muggles. It's absolutely ridiculous, but it is there for the sake of wish fulfillment and to explain to us why in real life we don't know about the wizards. I think it's an obvious thing that should change by the end of the series. Like, if we talk about story arc and world development, this is the big thing. It does feel unfulfilling as a story if we don't ever do anything with this. Especially so if we're making this whole genetics change, but even if not, at the very least for book 1, I think let's just have some people think this is a bad law. Just some people have opinions about it, because we never get that. It is weird. Why does nobody ever stop and think, hey, is this a good law anymore? I get why it was introduced during the witch trials, but that's hundreds of years ago. Aren't we past that now? Don't you think we could be using magic to help so many muggle lives out there? Why don't they get the right to know we exist? Also, why do all of the countries of the world agree with this statute of secrecy? Why don't certain nations take issue? Although that's a bigger tangent, we probably shouldn't get into that particular can of worms today. But yeah, just some people with opinions questioning this law. I think the clearest moment we get of this is Harry first learning about it and asking Hagrid, and then Hagrid saying,
Why? Blimey, Harry. Everyone would be wanting magic solutions to their problems. Nah, we're best left alone.
And then both Harry and the entire story itself goes, oh, okay, that makes sense. I'll never question it again. I don't think that's good enough as an answer. Hagrid can say that. I like that as a moment, but Harry doesn't have to be entirely convinced. Or maybe he is, but he starts to question it later down the line. Maybe Hermione makes a comment that questions the law, and Harry wonders if maybe she's onto something. Or maybe he realises he isn't sure what he thinks yet. He thinks he's just a kid with other things to worry about right now. Maybe that's all we do in book 1, planting that seed. As I keep saying, the more everybody just agrees on social or political issues, the less alive the world feels.
That's a sport. Wizard sport. It's like football in the muggle world. Everyone follows Quidditch.
Here's an obvious one. Quidditch makes no sense. It looks cool, and I think there are some intriguing ideas to it, like bludgers and a golden snitch. They do feel fun, but it doesn't work as a sport. Whoever catches the snitch wins 150 points and the game ends, which basically makes everyone apart from the Seekers redundant unless A, the other team is winning by over 150 points, which means they have to be a lot better, or B, the league table is decided by a points difference rather than just who wins and loses, which we kinda get in book 3, to be fair. There's various talk in that book about how Slytherin need to lose a game by however many points, and Gryffindor need to beat Ravenclaw by 200 points or something like that in order to work out top of the table. That kind of works, but I still don't think it's enough. I also feel like there's a distinct lack of strategy ever explained. We get lots of descriptions in this book about Oliver Wood running them through tactics all the time. Descriptions about the fact there is a blackboard and he has drawn lots of arrows and that he keeps talking, but never anything tangible enjoyable, you know? Which does just make it feel like this was a sport invented by someone who isn't really into sports. Maybe Joanne is, I don't know, but it doesn't really feel fleshed out. So I say catching the snitch can still end the game, because narrative-wise, you get to end on the heroic moment of Harry doing something. That gets to be the end of the scene, if that's how a match ends. So sure, but make it only give you 30 points. That then means a key part of the Seeker's job is communication with their team to understand when to catch the snitch and when not to. If they're trailing by more than 30, the job then largely becomes blocking the opposing Seeker from getting the snitch, which, you know, I'm hardly adding anything great here, and there are moments where blocking the opposing Seeker does happen in the books, but we're just making that have a touch more sense. We can now talk about seeking and blocking as two distinct things that a Seeker has to be good at, that Harry has to train at. I think there'd be no doubt Harry is phenomenally good at seeking, but blocking is a weakness Wood wants him to train at more in the first book. You know, it always annoys me how Harry is pretty much faultless in every Quidditch game, and Gryffindor are always really good, and they only lose when something unfair interferes, like the Dementors, or Harry missing a game due to being unconscious, whatever other inconveniences. I think let's have some growth in his ability at Quidditch. There are 2 Quidditch matches played in the first book. Match 1 is against Slytherin, where Quirrell tampers with Harry's broom, but he still manages to catch the snitch. Match 2 is against Hufflepuff, with Snape refereeing to stop Quirrell interfering again, and Harry once more wins. Both times when he is able to perform, when there aren't things stopping him, he is just pretty much perfect. And sure, the book wants the wish fulfillment of Harry does something heroic and everybody claps, but that's how the game ends, so it's always going to finish that way anyway. I think in the meantime, in match 1, they almost lose. Not just because of the broom tampering either. I think even before or after Quirrell starts doing that, there are moments where the opposing Seeker almost catches the snitch, because Harry isn't doing a good job of blocking him. I think their Seeker is called Terence Higgs. Let's make it Higgs almost catches it when Harry is unable to block him, but they are saved by Fred or George firing a blunder at Higgs at the last moment, and that prevents him and keeps the game going. Then Harry gets a moment later to catch it all heroically. Then, after the match, Wood talks to Harry about this. Tells him he was great at seeking, but he needs to get better at blocking. I think he lectures Harry and makes him train extensively at that. Which again always bothers me. There's so many descriptions about Wood putting them through rigorous Quidditch training in most of the books, but what is Harry doing in that time as the Seeker? He doesn't need to learn formations and tactics in the same way. So yeah, Wood tells him that, and then he trains a lot, and then in the second match of the book he is much better, and he successfully blocks the opposition Seeker in a moment that earns Wood's approval, before later catching the snitch himself. And I think this also makes sense character-wise, actually. Harry has always been described as very quick and agile and consistently ducking and dodging away from Dudley. So the idea he has to get better at the reverse of that, not dodging but facing things head-on, I think that's quite interesting. Plus, I think some of the changes we have made in the characterization section to Harry suggest someone who is a little more reluctant to face things head-on than he originally is in the books. We see a version of him who prefers to keep his head down and seeks invisibility, which obviously isn't quite the same thing here, but I think it still works. I think we're going to suggest, in terms of playing Quidditch, Harry has a mentality problem with blocking, where he knows he's got to clatter into this other player, but at the last moment he keeps flinching and keeps pulling away and doesn't quite 100% commit to it. So I think a little arc of Harry learning to face things much more head-on, which isn't to say he hasn't been brave before, because he's always faced up to things, but I think it's that kind of approach that's different. The charging in moments when you need to do that, you need to be a bit reckless, culminating in the final scene where he fights Quirrell head-on in this weird physical tussle we get where Harry burns his face off. Doing that rather than dodging and fleeing Quirrell, and I think this mini arc involving Quidditch and his change in mentality to blocking can kind of inform that. It doesn't align perfectly, but it kind of makes sense, and for something that I've only written in simply so Quidditch gets to mean something at all to his character, I think it's good enough. There are other strategies or tactics we could probably incorporate into Quidditch in a later book, but I think this is enough for the first one, focusing on Harry and how he needs to improve, rather than considering what's going on with Chasers or the Beaters too much. More generally, yes, I think we should also make mention that other wizard sports do exist, and other games in general, but we don't need to really go into what they actually are. You can just invent some weird names and loosely describe things in appropriate moments. Because right now there's Quidditch, there's Wizard's Chess, which is just chess, and then Gobstones, which is marbles, only you get acid spat into your eyes when you lose, which just sounds Delightful. So just make mention that there are other things as well. Mention some sort of weird card game where every time you blink, one of the cards in your hands changes to a different number. Or a sport like volleyball, but you have to fire spells at the ball to keep it in the air. Something like that would do the job fine.
"I'm sorry to say, I sold the wand that did it," he said softly. 13.5 inches, you. Powerful one, very powerful.
Okay, so this one sounds a bit weird. Maybe it's unnecessary complications to be adding, which is something to weigh up in all of this, you know? It's very easy for me to sit here and offer additions to the world building that enhance the world, but at what point does adding all of this get in the way of the story? At what point is it too much, too complicated, too difficult to explain without tons of exposition, or adding so many extra themes and conflicts that they get in the way of what the story was originally doing? Hypothetically, you might get to rewriting the story with all of these tweaks in mind and then discover as you sit down, tackling the nitty-gritty of it, that half of these changes don't flow so well as you might have imagined. That is entirely possible. However, I still like this idea, so I still want to mention it. Students get their wands at the age of 11, right? I think largely because it's dangerous giving them wands before an age where they can start learning to control their magic. That makes sense. But the problem is, you are still giving wands to 11-year-old children. Wands with the potential to do anything that spells make possible. Like, a student could very easily get really angry with another student one day. Maybe they have a bit of a fallout, a bit of a spat, and then one of them just loses their temper and shouts "obliviate," and then permanently erases all of their memories in a way no spell is able to undo. We see Lockhart end up in hospital after he suffers the obliviate spell. Is that not terrifying, giving that much power to 11-year-old children? Like, I know we're not supposed to take it seriously in book 1. Hermione uses Petrificus Totalis on Neville, leaving him entirely paralysed on the floor for, I imagine, hours. That would be legitimately traumatising to have all of your physical agency stripped of you like that. It's violation. We're not meant to take that seriously. Students can do that, and it's all normalised, and I don't think we actually ever see students get into trouble for this stuff either. There's always detentions for sneaking in or out, or for making a mess in ways that annoys Filch, but if the Ministry has the power to track what wands cast what spells, why is no one ever in trouble for casting curses on other students? Why? Okay, that's a separate issue actually, I wasn't planning to discuss, but partly it's because flinging weird curses at other students is kind of fun in a story, in an odd, slightly questionable way that potentially glorifies bullying. But either way, I can see the appeal and can see why just cutting that out might make the story less interesting. But at the least, I think we need to see teachers trying to tackle this problem, or the Ministry trying to tackle the problem. And here's my solution. I like the idea that locks can be put on wands. Magical, metaphorical locks that prevent wands from casting certain spells, or certain categories of spells. You know, a bit like when school computers would block certain websites, which was really annoying when you wanted to play Flash games on miniclip.com, but the computers wouldn't let you. So you either needed people who understood how to manage workarounds, or you needed to find websites that weren't blocked with good games on. That was my school days. When Ollivander sells a wand to an 11-year-old child, I think he checks their age and their education and issues them a wand with appropriate locks on it for that age. A wand that only allows them to cast grade 1 spells, for example. Your Lumos, your Wingardium Leviosa, and whatever else. Still a lot of power there to do a lot of harm, but safer. And I think with each year or with various exams you pass, you become entitled to unlock other grades of spells. You are granted a permit, in a manner of speaking. And also for certain classes. Flitwick or McGonagall or whoever will silently cast some spell they know to enable all the wands in the room to temporarily cast spells outside of that grade. Before putting the lock back on at the end of the lesson, teachers are granted the legal authority to do that for their students within the safety of a classroom setting. Not only is this sensible, but I think the more limitations we put on magic, the more creative workarounds you get to introduce. I think that's half the fun. So not only does this make more sense in terms of trying to clamp down on students cursing each other, but we're also now establishing some kind of underground struggle for students to jailbreak their wands. Fred and George might even specialise in that. Like with games on the computers, your two methods are either find ways to unlock the wands, which can be difficult and temporary because different magical locks get placed upon them each year to prevent students learning how to bypass them. You know, you can, if you're very perceptive, figure out what spell a teacher is casting to unlock wands in certain lessons. You can learn to replicate replicate that spell to unlock your own wand, or you can find various other ways of bypassing locks. However, it's still very difficult, you rarely manage to bypass every lock, but maybe you unlock grade 2 or grade 3 spells, or certain categories like light curses, rather than ones that give you horrifying power. Or maybe you go up to Fred and George and say, hey, I've been wanting to cast Locomotor Mortis, can you help my wand to do that specific spell? Alternatively to this struggle to unlock a wand, you find spells that haven't been locked. Even better, you invent your own spells that no one knows to have locked to begin with. Inventing spells is a thing we know happens in Harry Potter, but is never explored. I wish it was, because I'd be interested to know how spells are invented. I think if you can break locks, you can also break the trackers upon your wands too. I'm waffling a load here, but basically I think limitations and restrictions stimulate creativity. You introduce limitations like this and it provides a means for us to add story and character and to better understand how magic works, to have more of a dynamic around rule breaking and school punishments. I just think it's sensible but also fun and creates a lot of interesting scenarios. And if I was really going to push it as well, I'd make a 3rd or 4th year Ron start to become really good at inventing spells. He can't master them the way Hermione can, she's got the intellect and the studiousness, but he can think more creatively or strategically or something. I think that loosely makes sense for Ron as a character, and I think there's not enough he gets to excel at in the books, so this would be a cool thing.
The wand exploded with the force of a small bomb. Harry flung his arms over his head and ran.
Talking of how magic works, yeah. How the hell does magic work? You learn a word, you wave a wand in a certain way, but most of the time we don't know the rest. We don't know why it requires so much study or what's even involved. Like, I honestly have no idea what makes potions any different from ordinary Muggle world cooking or chemistry. All we see them do is follow instructions in a recipe book to chop certain things and heat stuff to certain temperatures. Why is that magic? Why can't Muggles do it? What makes it particularly difficult in comparison to other classes? I think we would need some vague ideas being mentioned about magically imbuing certain ingredients or performing reactions on ingredients that you couldn't do without magic. Like, I don't know. Say you want to make a luck potion, Felix Felicis. Okay, well we need certain ingredients, I don't know what, like parsley, some sage, rosemary and thyme, or alcohol. That would make sense as one of the ingredients, because alcohol arguably can boost a person's confidence. That's required for the potion. However, alcohol also has lots of other bad effects, like impairing the senses, so you need to magically alter the very matter of this ingredient itself. Modify the alcohol so it can boost confidence without impairing senses. That requires some sort of meditative focus to magically use your wand and alter it. There's some vague theory there. I mean, you could technically magically alter any ingredients to cause whatever effects you want, but that's really hard to do. It's often that you need to unpick ingredients that already half produce the desired effect, so you can kind of just give them a little extra push in the right direction. And maybe some potions require you to do things physically that are difficult without magic, like rapidly alter the cauldron temperature from boiling to freezing over and over, like zipping back and forth between the two every few seconds in a certain rhythm, or things like that you could only do really with a wand. That's what makes potions different to Muggle world chemistry in my books. The main question I'm raising though is, how does magic go wrong? We know if you aren't properly focused when apparating you can splint yourself, and we know if you aren't feeling enough joy when performing a Patronus charm, it'll sort of just wither away. Beyond that, any vague kind of philosophy for magic being explained would help a great deal. I've talked in the past about how Avatar: The Last Airbender has so much philosophy and meaning behind what is technically a magic system that it no longer feels like magic, but like something you can intrinsically understand. So let's just provide a really basic example solution. The kind of solution you almost get mention of at points in the story, like when Voldemort taunts Harry for failing to pull off the Cruciatus Curse, telling him he's got to feel it. Although maybe that's just a line in the film, I can't remember. Either way, I think to perform a spell you need to really feel it. Both physically in a kind of Tai Chi sense, you need to feel the energy building up from your center, channeling smoothly through your shoulder, up your arm, fingers, out of your wand, or maybe certain spells start in the toes or in the eyes. You need that, and secondly you need to feel it emotionally. We know Patronuses require joy, but maybe Wingardium Leviosa requires you to feel weightless. You know, to imagine that, to imagine feeling like you're a feather drifting on the wind, imagining the sensation so strongly that when you channel that feeling into your spell, that's what comes out. That is all very vague waffle. This is the bare minimum, but I think that is just about enough, because I think explaining that enables us to ask the question, what happens if you aren't feeling it right, or you're not physically channeling the energy in the right way, or you're emotionally feeling different. That's where you can get wild magic. You get the totally unpredictable and potentially dangerous things exploding from your wand. Stuff that can be used for comedy in some moments, but could also be used to create dramatic or serious consequences. Apparition causing Ron to get himself splinched is the only time I can think of a spell really going wrong and having consequences that affect the story. Unless you count Ron's broken wand causing Lockhart to wipe his own memory, but that's not magic itself going wrong. I think that is a problem. I think when the whole books are about magic and you never truly get to play about with the effects of magic because Joanne never invented some system to understand how it might go wrong, I think that leaves something quite unsatisfying. So if we just pop that idea into the first book, an understanding of how magic works and how it can go wrong, that's a thing Harry is taught about. They are stressed the dangers of wild magic, why you have to be careful and safe when trying to perform new spells. That's then a seed for later books. Now things could go wrong. I like the idea that a lot of Harry's first week at Hogwarts involves learning to focus better and meditate in those kind of ways to perform spells. But that probably best conclude our section on world building. Otherwise I will go on forever, and it's already getting quite pedantic, but there is just so much story to explore if you add more to the world, and I think demonstrating how much more you can add, not just in terms of covering plot holes, but how these fixes do all draw out theme and story and add more sides to different characters. I think that is the easiest way to criticise the world building here. So I think if there's any lesson to take away from this section, it's that world building isn't just about making your world make sense. It's not just about the realism or the accuracy or the consistency of the world, it's also about how interesting it is, how much more interesting you can make it, how much more it can tease out story. And I think that's something people don't talk about enough in terms of world building. We are not quite done yet though. There's one final chapter I didn't originally plan to discuss, but I think I probably should mention some things about, I'm going to call it something like diversity. Firstly, I wanted to point out in more than just pop-up text that the background you've been watching is from the channel Dave's Walks. I really should have said that earlier in the video. I found this channel though when we were both very small on YouTube, and he agreed to let me use his footage so long as I promote him, and I just really like doing that. This current walk is from a series of walking the entirety of the Cotswolds he's been doing. You can see the routes all mapped out in case you wanted to walk it too, and I just think that's such a cool idea. Anyway, I floated the idea earlier of talking a bit more about the fact there are barely any non-white characters in the story or the world. Is that a bad thing? Is it something we should change? What can we think about it? And there's three different arguments here, I think. One is, yes, you should make it more diverse, because this is all about improving the story, right? Like, there are a multitude of reasons a more diverse cast of characters would help this story. And even discounting the fact that it makes it easier to separate art from the artist by distancing Joanne from her own writing. Although that is technically whitewashing thinking about it, so I am slightly unsure about the ethics of this kind of video as a whole, but I think it depends on the spirit you approach this in. Improving the story to pretend nothing was ever wrong with it, or improving the story to highlight exactly what was wrong with it. Story reasons that would be helped here, though, I think are fairly obvious. For one, life is just diverse. In a way, that's what's so interesting about it, that everybody is unique, everybody has different experiences and different things you can learn from them or take from them, different things to connect over. Why would you not want your story to reflect that? Like, sure, you can make it all fantastical and weird, but we partly read stories to process our experiences about the world, engage with and understand the world. Why would you not want that? Secondly, though a similar point, it makes the world feel more real. If there is more diversity to it, it's easier to believe and immerse yourself in because it's now more of an actual community. If everybody is the same, then you haven't created a community, it's just a flat backdrop. It's why it's so much of a problem that nobody ever questions the statute of secrecy, or nobody has big cultural or political conflicts with each other. Community is fundamentally the coming together of differences. It needs that. It creates both conflicts but also harmony. Thirdly, it gives us more different things to relate to. Different people that a wider wider audience might relate to. That's not just a point that we can sell more books if there's something that appeals to everyone. Part of what makes stories and art so meaningful is that we do relate, you know? It's an important mix of empathizing with things beyond our own experience and also relating to things that are similar to our experiences. Things we currently struggle with. Reading about characters processing or overcoming some of our own struggles can help us to process them. It can also help us to not feel so alone and invisible in the world. Obviously, that's a great thing. So I've never really been passionate about the idea of adding diversity to stories. It's never something I've felt hugely critical of when you see a lack of it, but if I'm improving this story, why wouldn't I try to improve this stuff? Well, there are some arguments I should at least mention. The first being that it would require changing a lot, which is the thing I've been trying to avoid doing. You know, I'm trying to tweak the story we have rather than just writing a completely new one. Because, for example, Joanne's approach to the whole criticisms around the lack of black characters was to just say Hermione is black, actually. Or at least that she could be black. That the descriptions never contradict that possibility, even though they definitely do. But either way, you could do that. We could just say Hermione is black and Dumbledore is gay and whatever else, which I suppose is better than nothing, but it doesn't amount to much. I kind of feel like, what's the point? Are we just creating token characters there? Shouldn't we want it to really mean something? But if we did want it to mean something, that would require huge changes to the story. And plus, is that necessarily better? What's wrong in a character just being black and nothing else needing to be said because it's normal? And the third point is, how much leeway should we be giving to the original book? Because I think Joanne becoming the person she is half the reason I'd feel motivated to change some of this stuff in the first place. You know, if for whatever bizarre scenario Warner Brothers come to me and said, can you rewrite a new version of Harry Potter? 100% there would be some trans characters. Not just because it makes sense, but especially so to spite Joanne's beliefs. So in that sense, is that my main motivation behind discussing this? If so, that's not the best motivation. And I could waffle on some more arguments here, good or bad, and take it a lot further, but I think it's all basically to say that I'm going to leave this section of the video open-ended. I'm not going to do a here's what I would do, here's how I would fix it. I'm just curious to know what all of you would do. Would you change this stuff? Would you not? Which things would you change? Nonetheless, I do have a few thoughts I think are worth mentioning.
Ron couldn't see what was exciting about a game with only one ball, where no one was allowed to fly. Harry had caught Ron prodding Dean's poster of West Ham football team, trying to make the players move.
Obviously, we're just talking about race at the moment. You know, there's differences in terms of religion. I have no idea where that stands in the wizarding world. Are many wizards still religious? Do they have different religions? Do devoutly religious muggles just give it all up the second they discover magic is a thing? Maybe in Joanne's world, Jesus was not the son of God, but just a wizard tricking people. I hope that's not the idea. I hope the lack of religion is just for simplicity's sake with a story, but it's still an interesting question. Sexuality. Dumbledore is gay, apparently, but it's still never actually said, and it's not any characters who we might see engage in relationships. Though I think I'd save the sexuality question for the later books. There's a lack of disabilities, there's a lack of neurodivergence. These are all things we could have a very similar discussion about. I might talk about gender identity in a second, actually, but rather than go through each of them one in turn and say kind of similar repetitive things, we will mostly just focus on race. I feel diversity should mean more than that. For example, should cultural differences rear their heads at points here? I always found this very weird about Hogwarts. Like, the clear difference Joanne wants the books to explore are the differences between pureblood and muggle-born families. Obviously a difference that doesn't actually mean that much, and yet culturally there is a division here. And yet despite that, we rarely get to see much cultural difference other than the Malfoy saying racist things. Mostly it's the wizards saying something and Harry not knowing what it means because he's from a muggle world, and that's then just a vehicle to explain something to the readers. Apart from that, I can think of like the fact Dean Thomas has a poster of the West Ham football team hanging in a dormitory and Ron being confused about what football is and why the pictures don't move. That's kind of it. You could do so much more. I've already suggested the ways muggle-born students might want to play football at Hogwarts rather than just Quidditch. Maybe Dean Thomas joins a school club or a society who play football and petition for the school to build a football pitch for that. Maybe there are various petitions for Hogwarts to introduce introduce some sort of school telephone people can use. Surely Muggle students get really annoyed with the lack of phones. Those sort of differences would be interesting. I think that's part of diversity. Not just that people seem slightly different in certain ways, but exploring what that actually means. If it actually means anything much at all. How can we learn to connect and accommodate difference, or grow as people, find harmony? Should that kind of point be applied to ideas of race and ethnicity and cultural upbringing? For example, maybe Parvati Patil complains about how very European all the food is at the feasts. Maybe the lack of variety there causes her to feel a bit homesick to begin with. Maybe Seamus Finnegan gets annoyed sometimes whenever Ron and Neville talk about Quidditch because Seamus wants to talk about the Irish Quidditch League, but they don't know anything about that. Maybe we see Seamus tease Ron for his lack of knowledge about it. You know, all of those are very minor examples that, executed badly, could seem like making token characters. Yeah, you could obviously do so much more than just those minor examples, especially if there were other diverse characters that had more place within the story and more voice of their own. If we bring it back to Muggle racism as well, actually, one thing I would be very interested in is the subject of Muggle studies. Maybe I'm wrong, but I always kind of got the sense that was a class of understanding Muggle behaviour like they're some kind of creatures in a zoo. I think either have the story take issue with that fact, have Hermione drop Muggle studies in protest for that reason, or take time to express this is a subject about learning all the ways Muggle knowledge and technology can benefit the wizarding world. That's the thing they're studying. What if the Muggle understanding of medicine could actually enhance wizard healing spells in certain places? What if phones could be useful in the wizarding world? Maybe Muggle studies reflects a progressive approach to life that naturally highlights how diversity can benefit society, only it's a hugely unpopular subject with a lot of stigmas against it because the wizarding world is very backwards. That's a book 3 point though, actually. I should have saved that for a later video.
Harry and Ron overheard Parvati Patil telling her friend Lavender that Hermione was crying in the girls' toilets and wanted to be left alone.
Here's a quick one. Can Hermione have some female friends? Well, friends in general that aren't just Harry and Ron half reluctantly letting her tag along because she's helpful, but ideally girls. Obviously girls don't have to have female friends, obviously I'm not saying that, but I think it would be good here, A, because it does give space for more female characters. Until, like, Luna Lovegood appears, who also doesn't really get that much space to be a rounded character. Until she appears, it's basically one-dimensional love interests, teachers, a one-dimensional mother figure, and then Hermione. B, Hermione does sometimes just feel like a spare wheel. There are lots of times in several of the books where Harry and Ron fall out with Hermione and they don't speak to each other. And in those times, Hermione is basically completely on her own and very miserable until Harry and Ron so nobly decide she can be their friend again. I'm playing that up a little bit there, but Hermione should have some people she can hang out with during those times. Harry and Ron have Neville and Seamus and Dean, and there's an obvious place in the first book to rectify this. Like, remember the scene where Ron accuses Hermione of having no friends and she goes off to cry in the girls' bathroom? Well, Harry and Ron learn that's what she's doing through Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil. They both came across Hermione in the bathroom and they asked her what's wrong, and so they then later confront Ron and have a go at him about it. I think build on that. That could be a moment Lavender and Parvati connected with Hermione, offered her some comfort. It could be the beginning of a friendship. Sure, she still hangs out with Harry and Ron most of the time, but in the same way Neville or Seamus pop up to have moments, so can Lavender and Parvati with Hermione. She can mention things that they've said, or you can describe her talking with them in the common room. Nothing too much in book 1. We don't need to really do anything with them, but just establish that she gets on with them. I think a lot of this stuff would become much more interesting, for example, in the third book when Hermione has disagreements with them about their enjoyment of the divination class. It would also break things up in the sixth book when Lavender starts going out with Ron and there's a bit of a forced love triangle. I would like more friendly female relationships rather than just being like rivals in a love triangle. Yes.
Muggle women wear them, Archie, not the men. They wear these, said the Ministry wizard, and he brandished the pin-striped trousers.
So, I do want to mention this one. Technically, we can't be directly critical about the lack of diversity in terms of gender, since this is a story from the 90s and early 2000s. I think that's fairly common for then. I think most people would have accepted that had A, Joanne not gone off the deep end since writing the books in her transphobic views, and B, Tonks just being a slightly better character. Tonks very nearly is perfect representation and a perfect platform to explore gender gender identity. A character who often changes her appearance and prefers to be called by her last name. Someone in general who defies social norms. There could have been something interesting there that's probably to discuss in terms of the later books. Had Tonks been executed a lot better, I think that would have been absolutely enough. There were portions of the trans community who did associate with Tonks at the time, only Tonks' arc goes a little bit weird towards the end, but a couple of tweaks could resolve those issues. That would have been fine. But I can't help feeling tempted by the idea of doing more here. Or at least you have to acknowledge there is the potential to do more, whether you should or not. A story all about a child who technically lived in a closet, was made to suppress his magical ability, then suddenly learned about some very different magical community where people actually accept him for who he is. Like, there's a very easy metaphor you could make there, either to do with sexuality or gender. Also, just generally the story growing up with a cast of young children. Characters who get a bit older start to explore relationships and ideas of romance and responsibility and other more mature themes. Exploring gender identity could have easily been woven into that. Characters making sense of it, what feels right for them, what doesn't, what that actually means, what they understand of other people. That could very easily just be a little ordinary theme that crops up at points in this story. That would be quite good. You know, you don't have to go all out with this. We don't have to be turning Harry Potter into a trans awakening story for Harry. Although even that itself could be very fitting. You could so easily make that Harry's arc. I think actually even the times when he's, he can come across quite critical of femininity at points in the books. I think you could reframe all of that as Harry, like, first denying his feelings, projecting outwards from a position of shame. It's possible to do that. It would be meaningful and interesting and a fun little rebellion to J.K. Rowling. Whilst it's not something I'm going to do, I think it is worth throwing it out there. I imagine it probably already exists in fan fiction, actually. But yeah, I did want to mention that. In general, I've tried to mention different aspects you could explore in terms of diversity in the books, but I don't know how to best do it. I'm mostly just intrigued to see what people think themselves. Please comment thoughts if you have them.
The conclusion!
Are we here? Are we at the end of the video? I think we've covered most things from book 1, and a couple of things from the later books as well. Again, I think Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is the strongest of the books because it's young enough in age and early enough into the story to not have to deal with all the problems we get later down the line with the more serious, more expansive books. However, there is still a lot we need to do to make sure the transition from cartoonish children's book to something a bit older and less cartoonish does work. And mostly that has meant just laying seeds for characters to be less one-dimensional later on, opening space for the world to change and to be questioned by people, building in proper arcs, both for characters and general aspects of the story. We've explored why conflict and change is important for world building, how you can resolve plot holes or story problems in ways that open outwards instead of shutting things down, how world building can better inform story as a whole, why theme is so important, how it can be tied to arcs, how unintended themes can crop up if you aren't paying attention. Loads of stuff. But the point is, I think the main takeaway I have from making this video is the question of how I feel about Harry Potter. Too readily and too easily people fall into camps of either completely overlooking Joanne as a person in order to continue enjoying the story, and then also overlooking all of the book's faults, arguing who cares, it's a children's book, getting angry when people make criticisms of it, or we fall into the other camp of binning the whole thing in its entirety. I think there is a middle position though. Okay, if we enjoy Harry Potter, I think we are kind of forced to do that despite Joanne. It is hard not to get a little whiff of her bitterness and meanness here and there in the books. However, enjoying it in spite of all the book's flaws? No, if I'm honest, I think the flaws are part of my enjoyment. Like, do you know how much fun I had making this? Do you know how meaningful it is to see what you can learn about writing through an exploration of the faults in other stories? It's really fun, it's worthwhile. It is part of the reason I do love Harry Potter. I love getting to pick apart these things. I liked going about my day and suddenly thinking, oh hang on, wizards don't have primary schools. And then telling Kirsty, hey, wizards are never mentioned to have any primary schools. That's kind of weird, isn't it? How do they learn to read and write? I enjoy taking the piss out of it in very pedantic ways. It's fun to do that. It's fun to have those conversations with people. You know, my inner child does still love these books for everything that is good about them, everything that's fun and worthy of praise. However, that doesn't mean my adult self has to hate them for everything that's wrong. Harry Potter doesn't have to be some unresolved battle between my child and adult self. I think both parts can like Harry Potter with total awareness for everything that's wrong. J.K. Rowling, if I'm honest, is an influence on my own writing. Her books were part of what made me want to become an author when I was a kid, and I did take lessons from them, such as how clear physical descriptions can make a character memorable, or how a world is allowed to be a little bit stupid at times to some small degree. That's all true. And on the flip side, she is also an influence, as Dumbledore said about Lockhart, for what not to do. What she has taught me in that sense has been just as valuable to my own writing development. Here's the really interesting bit though. This is probably a typical thing I would say. That exploring all of this again, unifying the sides of me that feel good and bad about this, the little battle between the child and adult self. I think it's in recognizing the middle ground between those two that it becomes much easier to let Harry Potter go. I mean, why have I never let this story go? So many wonderful, even much better stories from my childhood that I love and can think fondly on, and yet I've never had the motivation to return to them. Never once have I gone back to the Red Bull series, and I adored those books. Stories that were great for me, but also are part of my past. I moved on and I read different things. Why did I keep on thinking about Harry Potter? Why is it hard to just move on? Okay, obviously I don't financially contribute to Joanne. I haven't played Hogwarts Legacy, and I probably won't watch the upcoming TV reboot of Harry Potter, but why do I still feel curious to know what they're like? Whether they are any good, what they do with the world that's at all different, if anything is different. And so it's now, having made this video, that I feel like I have come to a much more internal conclusion about Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And perhaps now I will never read this book again. Perhaps not. Perhaps it can just, despite the world's insistence to keep trying to shove this franchise down my throat, simply be a story I remember from my past. A story that was kinda good and kinda bad and did have an influence on me, but that now there are so many other stories to read and so many other stories to talk about. Okay, I could talk about the other 6 books as well. I would like to do that. But I also don't know if anyone is interested. I think this video took so much time, and unless by some stroke of luck, it does do very well for views and makes the whole thing financially worthwhile. Unless that happens, I probably cannot afford to make a video on the other books. I do depend on YouTube to pay my bills, and whilst I always continue to make videos I am passionate about, I still have to think slightly pragmatically about what might do well and when to release and work on certain videos. So if you do want a video on the 2nd book or the 3rd book or the 7th, please give this a like. I'm even going to say share the video. I never ask people to do that, but I think I should. And comment your thoughts, good or bad. Which of my ideas you think were terrible in this video? Which of them could be expanded further? What ideas you have of your own? I've said so many different things in this video. There are so many different things you could comment on. If you are hoping for me to actually go in depth and properly edit the book, like literally pick apart the sentences and write in my own version of Philosopher's Stone with all the changes I've suggested, do not expect that to happen. Not unless there's like so much appeal for that I could afford the sheer amount of months it would require. And even then, I know I would come out of that experience having written something pretty good, but also discovering that a lot of the ideas I've suggested were flawed for various reasons I couldn't perceive at the time. The finished thing would probably still be a bit of a mess. So no, I'm unlikely to make that. I will just say like the video and subscribe if you fancy. If you really want to help me out, you can support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee, but otherwise, thank you for watching this far, and hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Grace, Kellyanne Davidson, Luke Orr, Michael Gallagher, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you. What? You're still here? That didn't sound convincing. That didn't sound like fake surprise. You saw the end of this video, but you're still here. Oh my god, what a surprise. Either that's because you're doing something while watching this video and you haven't, like, come back to your phone to click off it yet. Or you saw on the timeline there was a little bit extra to this video and your curiosity compelled you to endure an extra bit of boredom of me waffling just to know what's here. Nothing is here. I've just never made a video anywhere near this long before, and a post-credits scene feels like a thing YouTubers do after a big journey of a video. Oh, my phone just rang. I'm pretty sure that's a thing YouTubers do. I don't watch many long videos, I've got to be honest, but why not? Why don't I just talk here and not even edit out all the pauses or stutters, or not even add video, just have a black screen, and I'll address some other pet peeves with Harry Potter. I did have notes I made a couple of days ago about other things I could add somewhere. Here they are. Number 1, the sentence structure. This will be hard to explain, but Joanne has a habit of writing sentences that all feel the same. Someone does something plus a physical feature described in a certain way. Like, Potter, Snape spat, his eyes glinting malevolently. Not again, Neville mumbled, his lips trembling. I won't warn you again, McGonagall said, her mouth twitching. I've made all those examples up myself there because I can't be bothered to find real ones, but you get the basic structure. Someone says something, describe how they said it, and then describe a feature as they said it. You get that so much. It's not a problem with it, and you do kind of repeat the ways you phrase things without noticing when you write. That does happen, but there's so little variety to the sentence structure in these books. It does become really, really grating, and it's not big enough an issue for me to really criticise in book 1, because I do think for a children's book that this one much more is than the others. It's fine, but it still annoys me. Number 2. In my examples about Crabbe and Goyle, I forgot to include the quote, Crabbe and Goyle guffawed stupidly, which just makes me laugh, describing what they do stupidly. Number 3, I absolutely despise, I despise the Sorting Hat song in this book. I despise any of the songs it sings in any of the books. I just think they're awful. And the only way it'd work is if the vast majority of students groaned every time the Sorting Hat sang and laughed about how cheesy it is. The fact everybody cheers it on as great is just unbelievable. And it makes me feel like the author is creeping into the books here. Like, Joanne wrote a song she thought was good, therefore all of the characters do as well. And it's never good. My speculative view is that she was inspired by Tolkien. I think we know she was inspired by him anyway, but he wrote a lot of songs in his books. Some of them actually very good, some of them at least passable, especially with the context that Lord of the Rings is set in like an old world where folk singing has great importance and value in their culture. There's a real point to it. That works there. Joanne, I think, wanted to do something similar here because she likes the songs in those books, only she couldn't write very good songs, and I just hate them. The only ones I hate more than the Sorting Hat's songs are the school song itself that goes, Hogwarts, Hogwarts, Hoggy, Hoggy, Hogwarts, teach us something, please. I cannot imagine any student seriously singing that, like, really? And then Snape's riddle for the potions task at the end of this book. I also hate that. I think it's not just that it was convoluted is the reason they cut it from the film. It's just, I just don't like the riddle. I don't like it. Number 4. It's kind of a vague point that sort of builds off the last one, but I don't think Joanne can write children characters very well. She's not great at characterization as a whole. We've discussed that. But I think she particularly struggles with the laddish troublemaker sort of boy students that she also seems to really love. You know, the Fred and George, the James and Sirius, to an extent Harry and Ron. Mainly it's Fred and George, though. I love the idea of them. I like what they represent, and I remember finding them quite fun as a kid. And the movies do a pretty good job, I think, to make them more fun. But in the books, so much of their dialogue feels so lame to me. I don't know, am I alone in that? I'm not sure. Maybe I've just spent too much time as a children's therapist working with gobby or rebellious kids who are just so much more than Fred and George, so much more interesting and fun. And their insults or their sarcastic quips always just feel very forced and very flat. I'm always kind of aware they are written by a middle-aged person, you know? There's a surprising lack of wit to them, I think, as well. Sometimes it works, sometimes they're fine, but sometimes I just find them so lame, and how much the narrative wants you to enjoy them only makes that worse. Number 5, I had some notes for this the other day. I don't know where they are, but I can't remember what number 5 is. I think it was number 6 as well. I'm not sure what that was either. No. So, maybe this is the end of the video then. Maybe this is how it ends. It just sort of withers out. It never concludes. I just forget the other things I wanted to say. But if you watch this far, maybe I can leave you with something to comment, so I know people did watch this far. If I can, like, think of anything to share, something you can mention that's... I'm going to release a poetry book soon. Later this year. I just need the illustrations for the contents page tweaking to like match the exact page numbers and to fix a couple of different formatting issues that I don't yet know how to fix. So if you have watched this far, mention something about that in your comments, or if that's too dull, that might be actually, then just comment the phrase, "Get back to work, Roger." My name's not Roger. I don't know anyone called Roger, but maybe someone who will scroll the comments, see that, and remember not to waste their time with 4-hour videos by someone random about an old children's book. Yeah, do that. Now it is the end of the video.